Good morning, everybody. You were live in the CNN newsroom. I'm Jim Acosta in Washington. Right now, voting is underway in nearly all 16 Super Tuesday states in what effectively could be the beginning of the end of the 2024 presidential primaries. The American people will make their voices heard, and barring a major upset, the country will be one step closer to the prospect of former President Donald Trump being the presumptive nominee of the Republican Party. For the GOP, more than one-third of the total nominating delegates are at stake. Trump maintains a commanding lead, on track to win more primaries and caucuses than any non-incumbent candidate in history. All of that raising the question, could this be the last stand for Nikki Haley, who clings to a single primary victory? CNN has correspondents coast to coast on what voters are saying as they head to the polls. CNN's Stephanie Elam is live in Santa Ana, California, and CNN's Elena Trine is live in Richmond, Virginia. Stephanie, we want to remind our viewers, brand new show out on the West Coast, starts at 7 a.m. Please tune in. Pardon me for putting in that plug. But there's also an election going on today, Stephanie. I saw Taylor Swift in the last several minutes has put out a statement encouraging people to vote in her state of Tennessee. What's standing out to you out in California right now?
Well, Jim, the other thing that's happening at 7 a.m. local time, congratulations on the show, is the polls just now opened. And someone back there yelled, "The polls are now open." That just happened. So while the polls are open, people here have been dropping off ballots at that box there, because in California, you can vote by mail for a few weeks now. But what's really consequential here today is the Senate election. And what's happening here in this primary, there are 3 U.S. representatives and 1 Republican who are going after Senator Dianne Feinstein's seat. Remember, she passed away in September. So Adam Schiff, Katie Porter, Barbara Lee, all going for that position, as well as Steve Garvey as well. He is best known for being a baseball player, played for the LA Dodgers and the San Diego Padres here. Adam Schiff, far and ahead winning as far as money and support from his party as well. He's really hoping to make this about Democrats versus Republicans, because in November, what they do here, the top 2 people who win this primary vote today will go on to that main ballot in November. So he's trying to make this contest about Democrats versus Republicans, because in California, Democrats outweigh Republicans 2-1 here. So that would ease his chances for likely winning come November. But that's what happens here, as we see a few voters are making their way in here now. Jim.
All right, Stephanie Elam, thank you very much. Let me go to Elena Trine out in Virginia. Elena, what's happening on your end?
Well, Jim, polls opened here in Richmond at 7 a.m. And we've seen a lot of people come through so far, a steady stream of folks heading into the polling location behind me. And look, this is a state that is important for both Donald Trump and Nikki Haley in the Republican primary. Of course, Biden is also in the ballot in this state. But from my conversations with the Trump campaign, they really do view this as a battleground. Even though he lost this state in 2016 and 2020, they do think in a potential general election rematch with Joe Biden that this state is in play. Now, we also know that for Nikki Haley, this is one of few states where it's an open primary. That means Republicans, Democrats, Independents, they can vote for whichever candidate they want. And we heard from some voters who gave us some interesting color and insight into what decision they made today. Take a listen.
I voted for Donald Trump. I'm really excited about what he's doing with the economy. I think it's really going to benefit our country in the next 4 years.
I think it's disappointing. It's sort of a repeat of 2020. I would love to have had some different candidates. I had hoped that Trump would go away.
Now, Jim, that first voter was a first-time voter, very eager to cast his vote for Donald Trump. The second was a Democratic voter. He said he voted for Biden, but as you could hear, he doesn't want a general election rematch between the two, between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And I heard that from a lot of people here today. So we'll chat with more and give you more insights as we get them. Jim?
Yeah, they may not want that, but it looks like that's what they're going to get. All right, Stephanie Elam, Elena Trine. Thank you to both of you. Really appreciate it. Let's discuss all of this now. CNN political commentator, Democratic strategist Paul Begala, former Republican Congressman Joe Walsh of Illinois, and former communications director for Vice President Kamala Harris, Ashley Etienne. Paul, let me start with you. This morning, I'm not sure if you saw this, Donald Trump started off the day by insisting that fascists and communists are really in charge over at the White House. Let's listen.
I don't think he knows what to say about many subjects, actually. It's really the people that surround him. It's the fascists and the communists that surround him. They're making the calls. They're calling the shots. He's not calling the shots.
Paul, it's a continuation of what you hear on the right, that Biden is out of it. He's slipping and all of this stuff, and that the fascists and the communists at the White House are in charge.
Right. Well, we all
response.
remember when Joe Biden confused Barack Obama with Donald Trump. Oh, wait, no, that was Trump. We all remember when Joe Biden was under oath and he mistook a woman he raped for his wife. Oh, no, that was Donald Trump. In other words, I think the coverage of this has frankly, not been very accurate, right? Biden's gaffes have always been built in. He's always had his verbal slips, as we all do. I've known him 35 years. I haven't seen it really get worse.
Yeah.
Trump is getting worse. He's melting down.
Paul, I'm so glad you said that, because let's watch this.
And Putin, has so little respect for Obama that he's starting to throw around the nuclear word today. You heard that, nuclear. The Biden border will, well, you know this, right? The Biden border bill. Did you just see Maduro, Venezuela? It's unbelievable. We are a nation that just recently heard that Saudi Arabia and Russia will be reducing.
Paul, to your point.
Right. If Biden
it's
did
not
any of
covered
that,
evenly. It's not
if
covered
Biden
evenly.
did any of that, it'd be front page New York Times, 4-inch wood. Okay? But Trump does it, and he gets a pass. And I just think we ought to be fair.
Joe?
Right, but you're right. It's not fair, but it is the reality. The polling shows that most Americans, most Democrats, think Joe Biden's too old. Joe Biden is the old that most Americans concede. Trump is he's so nuts, he's so bad, he's such a psychopath, he's so anti-American, we overlook the fact that he's old. But Biden just looks old. But it's an opportunity, I think, Jim, for the president. He and he alone can show he's up to the job.
And Ashley, I mean, you worked over at the White House. This must have been a constant source of frustration over there.
The narrative that Joe Biden's old.
Well, and that isn't really covered evenly. That Trump says all this stuff at these rallies. And
the campaign now is meeting with the New York Times and other outlets to talk about this issue, how the coverage is imbalanced. But what I find very interesting about Donald Trump is when his back is against the wall, when he feels threatened, that's when his rhetoric becomes even more intense, even more bigoted, even more extreme. And that's what we're seeing right now. So I think you're absolutely right. But the way in which we should cover this is Donald Trump's vulnerabilities. That's what he's exposing to us right now, that he feels very threatened by Nikki Haley's peeling off 250,000 voters in Michigan. I mean, that's a sizable number that could really, tank his general election. So that's sort of how I see it. But you're right. The campaign and the White House is frustrated by this issue. They're reaching out to news media to really drive this point home and to really to make the case that, listen, we got to do this fairly.
Jim, we can't gloss over your lead. You said that Trump will lock down the Republican Party nomination tonight.
Pretty much.
And he will.
He may not get the number of delegates to clinch, but he's going to be on the cusp.
And I think it was always his. But think about that. The man who tried to overthrow an American election 3 years ago is going to be the Republican Party nominee. I mean, just think about that every now and then.
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, we have Adam Kinzinger coming up in a few months. We're going to talk about just that. And Paul, I mean, Nikki Haley spent her last public event ahead of today's contest, arguing about Trump's electability, some of these issues that we're talking about that Joe just mentioned. Let's listen to that.
At some point, maybe we should say the reason that America keeps losing is because of Donald Trump. In order to change it, it's going to take a lot of courage. Courage from everybody here. Courage for me to run. And courage for every one of you to know, don't complain about what happens in a general election if you don't vote in this primary.
Yeah, I mean, Paul, we've compared this to, Thelma and Louise, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. I mean, they are ride or die with Donald Trump. I mean, Nikki Haley can make that argument. It's a compelling argument. A lot of Republicans agree with it, but they're going with Trump.
That base is. Yeah. And God bless him. Nikki Haley's creating a permission structure, though, for a lot of good Republicans, Joe Walsh Republicans, to say, I can be a Republican and a good Republican and separate myself from this guy who, my old man was a Republican. Okay, he believed in lower taxes, strong defense, family values. I mean, the Reagan Joe Walsh, Republican Party. And what Haley's doing is very important. 10, 20, 30, 40% sometimes are Republicans are saying, no, I don't want this. This creates a huge opportunity for Joe Biden, right? If the other side abandons the center, capture the center.
Yeah, what do you think?
I mean, I think the question is whether or not Nikki Haley has the courage, to use her word, to stay in the race, to continue to drive home the point about Donald Trump's vulnerabilities. Because with each contest, it becomes clearer and clearer that he's got a general election problem. Joe Walsh and I were talking about this backstage, whether or not she'll have the courage. Okay, the question is whether or not she'll hold that number, but whether or not she'll fold after today. But I think the question is whether or not she'll have the courage to stay in it. Does she run as a third-party candidate? I'm talking to all my Republican friends who are feeling totally dismayed by what's happening right now.
But does Joe Biden want that? I mean, if Nikki Haley does that, I mean, she could peel some of those Republicans who might vote for a Joe Biden in the November election.
Sure, but the point is what's in the best interest of the Republican Party, in the best interest of democracy. And to some degree, her staying in the race is in the best interest of those two things.
Jim, I worry that she's already crossed the Rubicon. I mean, Paul, what happens? I still expect her when she gets out to endorse Trump. And so then what does that mean for everything she's been saying for the past month and a half? I don't understand it.
Well, the miracle of videotape. Right? The Democratic Party, the Biden campaign should, and must.
They'll use it.
Take those comments and send them back to those voters. Because she endorsing Trump doesn't mean all of those people will. Now, a great many will, because they're Republicans, and I respect that. I really do. But a whole lot of those folks are being given permission to break with Trump. And guess what? The sun still rose in the east. The earth still spun in its axis. Those of us who believe in a round earth. So I think this is a huge vulnerability. I think Trump has shown more softness, more weakness in these primaries than I expected.
Absolutely.
And I think Biden has shown more strength, frankly. What if Biden had lost the D.C. primary? We'd need special coverage. Trump just lost it and nobody cares.
Yeah, I mean, actually, there is something to be said for that. I mean, Joe Biden has, captured just about every Democratic vote that you can throw a dead cat at.
Sure, and not just
during this primary process, with the exception of Michigan. There was a little bit of that uncommitted vote, but in New Hampshire, a lot of these other states, he's done pretty well, a lot better than expected. There was no Bernie Sanders candidate this time around. There wasn't anything like that.
Absolutely, and I think that's a fact that's been lost. Yeah. But in addition to that, his fundraising numbers are up. He's out fundraising Donald Trump, out fundraising the RNC. That is also a fact we're not talking about. I mean, Joe Biden's in an incredibly strong position, and then you add on top of that the fact that he's, his record is incredibly powerful. The bipartisan infrastructure bill to the economy doing better now. So he's in a really solid position. And I think, to your point, that's a narrative that's not being talked about
All
enough.
of that, except he's in a dead heat right now with a man who's got 91 felony counts against him and is a psychopath.
But polls don't matter at this
Joe
point.
Biden has to show he's up to the job.
I do want to mention, because at the top of the hour, Stephanie Elam mentioned that Adam Schiff is running in one of those down ballot races in California. Today, the GOP is also voting for some of its next party leaders. Down in North Carolina, Republican Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson is running for governor, according to a CNN review of past old social media posts talking about Mark Robinson down in North Carolina. He has downplayed the atrocities of Nazi Germany. He's described homosexuality as filth. He's mocked school shooting survivors. He has referred to abortion as, quote, genocide. Joe, your sense of this next field, this next wave of Republican candidates coming up?
Trumpism has moved beyond Trump. And there are a lot of Trumps in this party. There's a lot of responsible Republican money in these races trying to defeat some of these real extreme candidates. We'll see if it succeeds.
All right. Well, guys, happy primary day. Happy Super Tuesday. It's kind of a weird Super Tuesday, but we're going to go with it. Yes. That's what we do here. All right, guys. Thanks very much. Appreciate it. Stay with CNN. We follow all the races on this Super Tuesday. We have special coverage beginning tonight at 6 p.m. Eastern. Stay tuned to that. Still to come this morning, while the Supreme Court allowed Trump to remain on the ballot, the pressure he is now putting on the nation's highest court. He wants immunity. That's what he said yesterday. And we'll talk about that in just a few moments with former Congressman Adam Kinzinger. He's next. After prevailing in his challenge to stay on the ballot, Donald Trump now wants total immunity for his actions as president. He's asking the Supreme Court to give it to him.
I hope that the justices, because they'll be working on some other cases, but one in particular, presidents have to be given total immunity. They have to be allowed to do their job. If they're not allowed to do their job, it's not what the founders wanted, but perhaps even more importantly, it will be terrible for our country.
Joining us now to discuss, CNN senior political commentator, former Republican Congressman Adam Kinzinger. Adam, good morning. Welcome to the news show. Thanks a lot, as always, for coming on. Let's just dive right into this. What would happen if Donald Trump got his way and presidents had total immunity?
Well, it's good to be on with you, by the way, and I'm excited. But look, it would be total chaos, total and utter chaos. It would be, I mean, that's the definition of authoritarianism. It's not even, we wouldn't even have to really go 2 or 3 iterations deep into what this means. What he's saying, and I wish next time somebody interviewed the former president, I wish I would ask him, so do you agree that now Joe Biden has total immunity for anything he can do? And I'm sure he would hem-haw around that. What he's saying, and again, in the arguments to the, I think it was the appellate court, where they ask, so if he, you know, if the former president, or if a president hired SEAL Team 6 to take out his political opponent, would that be okay? And basically they were saying, yes, you think about the implications of that, and it's nonsensical. I'm disappointed the Supreme Court took up the case because it delays what I think is a very important case for the American people to see. But I think this one comes back pretty much just as one-sided as the Colorado decision. It'll either be 9-0 or potentially 8-1 saying no immunity.
Yeah. And Adam, I mean, you served on the January 6th committee. We were kind of talking about this in the previous panel. And when you think back to that day, and we're showing some of the footage now, and all the work that you did on that committee uncovering how Trump lied about the 2020 election, how he tried to strong-arm state and federal officials to overturn the election, how he endangered the life of his own vice president. Did you ever think in those days after January 6th that Trump would be on the verge of becoming the Republican nominee like he is today?
No, not a chance. And for 187 minutes, Jim, for the first time in his life, he resisted peer pressure to act because he wanted to see if his insurrectionist would actually succeed. And only when law enforcement seemed to turn the tide did he then begrudgingly, 187 minutes of silence, did he then begrudgingly put out a slight statement. No, you know, after January 6th, there was about 3 weeks in the House caucus where we were all kind of, everybody was quiet, trying to figure out what would happen next. Fred Upton, who's sometimes on the network, we call him the Upton prophecies. He said, I think Donald Trump runs again. And I'm like, dude, you're nuts. You're nuts. There's no way he runs again. And it was when Kevin McCarthy went to Mar-a-Lago that literally within the House caucus, you all of a sudden saw people kind of drop their head and say, I guess we're going with Trump again. And the dominoes fell. I never expected that in the face of that we'd be where we are, because I thought, Jim, that people had red lines that they were unwilling to cross when they ran for public office, that they were willing to play politics, because we all have to, but that there was a here but no further. And unfortunately, almost all of my colleagues crossed what I thought was a substantial red line that was inherent in the oath you take for office.
And, you know, we are talking about the horse race a little bit today, and I think we were also talking about the stakes, and you were just talking about that a few moments ago. But, you know, a horse race kind of requires horses. And, you know, Trump is on the verge of becoming the GOP presumptive nominee. I mean, on Super Tuesday, so early in the process, what do you think about this GOP field just falling apart as it did, unable to stop Trump's rise? I mean, I guess I kind of think back to that one Republican debate when they were all asked to raise their hand if they would vote for Trump, you know, kind of no matter what he does. And yet here we are.
Yeah, and that's exactly why we're where we are. I mean, if you think about a base voter, right, and, you know, Donald Trump gets indicted and stuff, and Donald Trump says he's a victim. You know, all these base voters, they looked at Trump, obviously he's their main influencer, but then they look to everybody on that debate stage and say, but I wonder what these men and women are saying. And when all but 1 or 2 say he's a victim of the DOJ, he's a victim of the deep state, Donald Trump did nothing wrong, and in fact, even if he is found guilty of these, I will support him. We can't blame the base then for saying, oh, okay, well, all the Tier 2 folks running for office think that Donald Trump is a victim. Now I think he's a victim, and if he's a victim, I want him to win again to push back against the deep state. This is a failure, yes, this is a failure of leaders in the GOP that aren't named Donald Trump, because they all collapsed. And now you're seeing the result of that. I mean, even Nikki Haley, and I hope she does well tonight, but even she raised her hand and said she'd support him, and I think a lot of people expect that when she drops out, she will. I hope she doesn't, but that's the expectation.
Yeah, and I do want to take a look at the legal challenges for Trump on the calendar. We showed this to our viewers a little bit. I mean, it's kind of incredible, Adam. He has been very successful at delaying a lot of these proceedings. You were just mentioning a few moments ago the immunity issue, which may push the Jack Smith trial and case beyond the November election, depending on how that plays out. What does all of this say about our checks and balances? I mean, you served in Congress. What does it say about checks and balances and how our judicial system has dealt with Trump? Does it allow for too many delays? Does it allow for too many? I can hear there are probably some folks on the right at home right now just bristling at that question and say, well, that's how the system is supposed to work. It's supposed to protect everybody. What do you think?
Yeah, they still also won't be screaming that's how the system's supposed to work when Donald Trump gets indicted. But yeah, I agree. I mean, look, here's the big point. The January 6th committee spent a year getting information. When we presented it to the American people, that's when the DOJ actually started their investigation against Trump, particularly because they were like, oh my goodness, there's real information here. I wish we could take a time machine and have DOJ actually pursuing this simultaneous with us because we'd be a year ahead of schedule. That said, look, I mean, I want Donald Trump to be afforded every legal opportunity to defend himself because it needs to be fair. But if the election happens and he wins before these trials take place, rest assured, America, rest assured, he will demand the DOJ, he'll compel the DOJ to drop these cases. And even if he's convicted and wins, he will certainly test the constitutional limits of whether he can pardon himself. And you're going to have a really hard time. Checks and balances are strong as long as people that take the oath take their oath seriously, because their oath, individual oaths, are the only thing that holds checks and balances and the guardrails of democracy in place.
Yeah, I mean, you make a good point. I mean, I suppose if there are the folks out there who are saying, yes, he should have every opportunity to delay things and appeal things and so on. But to your point, what will they say if he becomes president of the United States and just says to the Department of Justice, get rid of these cases? Is that also in keeping with our constitutional process? Is that also how this country is supposed to work? I wonder what they'll say then. All right, Adam Kinzinger, great to see you as always. Thanks so much.
Yep.
All right, appreciate it. Voters across 16 states are casting their ballots. This is a live look at voters in Massachusetts. The impact the IVF fight could have in the November election. We'll talk about that in just a few moments. Stay with us. That's next. New this morning, dramatic video appears to show the moment Ukrainian forces say they hit and sank a Russian Navy patrol boat. Take a look at this really astonishing video. You can see an unmanned drone approaching the vessel just before a large explosion. This happened near the Kerch Strait, which separates Crimea from the coast of Russia. It also comes as Kyiv says it has stalled Russia's advances around the city of Avdiivka on its eastern flank. Nick Payton-Walsh joins us now from eastern Ukraine. Nick, tell us more about this really astonishing video that we're seeing this morning and what else is happening where you are.
Yeah, Jim, look, it's a refrain now, frankly, of Ukraine, quite surprisingly, using unorthodox means like drones, things we didn't expect to see at the start of the war, to hit part of Russia's Black Sea fleet and essentially deprive them of a space they used to consider safe. The most recent last night, the Sergei Kotov, a patrol boat, 7 dead apparently, according to Ukrainian officials, because of the use of a drone attacking it. They've also claimed hitting a bridge 500 miles inside Russia, and President Zelensky said they took 15 jets out in February alone that belonged to Russia. So a lot of claims by Ukraine that they're doing very well in unexpected areas. What is undisputable, though, is the lack of US aid, the lack of ammunition, the lack of personnel Ukraine has. It's causing a very dire situation on the front lines at a time when Russia is deeply in the ascendant here. You cannot deny that at all. There are villages that Ukraine said it would be able to hold as its defensive line when they left Avdiivka 2 weeks ago that are now under constant threat. All helping Russia because the Ukrainians simply don't have the equipment they need. Here's what we saw on the front line in the past days.
It's a lonely path ahead. The Russians have never been louder or closer. Occupied Bakhmut is just up the road. But now some Ukrainian tank guns are silent just when they're needed most. Here, they don't have enough shells.
Sometimes they just won't fire at all for a whole day. Other days they'll be shooting constantly. And I tell you, it is loud on the other side of that hill, and it's sort of surreal. to hear that sort of noise over there and see this tank unit having a ration their ammo.
Без зброї люди є, але беззброєно ми самі це не ті війни, що коли з мечем чи шаблею ми могли щось зробити.
We learned they didn't fire at all that day, or the day before, or the next day. The silence here is what losing sounds like. So too is what these soldiers had to say.
Если американцев не решат вам давать деньги, что будет?
Я думаю, що ми всі загинемо просто. Оті, хто тут зараз є, нас не буде.
Is this the worst you've seen it?
Yeah, definitely. I think this year is going to be the worst year in the war. Well, I do know that there's certain units that they're running out of tanks.
How angry does it make you?
Yeah, I'm pissed. I'm absolutely pissed off. There's no point in trying to paint this in any sort of light where it's good for us that Russia takes Ukraine. That's going to be very, very, very bad for us geopolitically.
You just should understate here, Jim, exactly how dire it is beginning to look on Ukraine's eastern frontier. Separate news, though, the International Criminal Court, remember, they put out an arrest warrant, an indictment against Vladimir Putin for the forced deportation of children from Ukraine to Russia. Well, they've just announced that 2 key Russian commanders in charge of Black Sea fleets themselves, those targeted by that strike earlier on today, well, they are also subject to arrest warrants because of what they say is targeting of civilian infrastructure and civilians over the past years or so. So startling development there that suggests the international ramifications legally for Russia going forwards because of its atrocities here in Ukraine. Back to you.
Yeah, and Nick, I mean, getting back to what that soldier was saying a few moments ago and the frustration that people feel inside Ukraine, really all around the world, that they're not getting the weapons that they need. They have to be sort of improvisational when it comes to these attacks. I mean, this drone attack, for example, on the Russian ship, I mean, it kind of shows how, I mean, Ukraine has had to resort to these sorts of tactics to get the upper hand at times.
Yeah, look, I mean, there's no doubting the Ukrainian ingenuity here, using video gaming consoles, sort of headsets to fly drones specifically into Russian armoured vehicles, you know, technological advancements that NATO armies, frankly, are studying at the moment because of their efficiency and accuracy as well, and things like those naval drones too. But ultimately, they need the heavy weapons, they need the financing to even have a chance. And that's what's so despairing here as you watch them try to band-aid over the problem here that is essentially down to a very small number of Republican congressmen essentially giving Putin a very good shot at seeing significant progress in this war, Jim.
All right, Nick Payton-Walsh, thank you very much. Coming up, more pressure from the Biden administration for a ceasefire in Gaza, this time coming from the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, his comments this morning as he meets with his Qatari counterpart. That's next. Secretary of State Tony Blinken just wrapped up his meeting with his Qatari counterpart as the Israel-Hamas ceasefire talks are ramping up. This video is just from a short time ago, and in the next hour, Blinken is expected to meet with Israeli War Cabinet member Benny Gantz, who is also meeting with Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin as part of a 3-day trip to meet with senior Biden administration officials. And CNN's chief national security correspondent Alex Marquardt joins me now. Alex, tell us more about these talks. I mean, obviously at a very critical moment.
A critical moment, and the meetings today here in Washington just underscore how important these talks are and the figures who are involved in these talks. Now, what is clear, Jim, is that even though there has been some progress in the past few weeks, negotiators are still struggling to get Israel and Hamas on the same page, and the clock is ticking. The U.S. has repeatedly said that they want to have a ceasefire in place by the Muslim holy month of Ramadan, which starts early next week. If fighting were to continue during Ramadan, that could certainly inflame tensions even farther. So the mediators, the U.S., Egypt, and Qatar working feverishly to try to get to a deal. Here's a little bit of what Secretary Blinken had to say earlier today, standing alongside the Qatari Prime Minister. Take a listen.
And here, we have an opportunity for an immediate ceasefire that can bring hostages home, that can dramatically increase the amount of humanitarian assistance getting into Palestinians who so desperately need it, and can also set the conditions for an enduring resolution. And it is on Hamas to make decisions about whether it is prepared to engage in that ceasefire.
Jim, you can hear there the U.S. is putting it on Hamas. The Biden administration has essentially said that Israel has agreed to the broad framework. We have reported that Israel has demanded a list of the hostages that Hamas is holding, both dead and alive, so that they could have a sense of who would be freed in a hostage deal. There have also been talks in Cairo over the past few days that Israel has not attended because they did not get that list. We heard Egyptian state television earlier today saying that there are still difficulties in those talks. Jim.
All right, Alex Marquardt, thank you very much. And in the meantime, there is clear and convincing information that hostages held in Gaza were sexually abused. That's according to a new United Nations report. CNN's Paula Hancock joins me now from Abu Dhabi. Paula, the report says it's reasonable to believe that the sexual violence is still ongoing. Is that right?
That's right, Jim. Of course, that shows just how urgent it is to try and get the hostages out of Gaza, among, of course, many other things. But what we're hearing in this report is from the U.S. Special Envoy for Sexual Violence in Conflict. It was at the end of January. She had 2 weeks talking to witnesses, for example, to the October 6th attack by Hamas, also to some hostages who had been released from Gaza, and also some survivors from the attack. Now, in this report, they say that there is clear and convincing information that there was rape used as a weapon, and that it potentially is still going on. Also specifying on October 7th, they believe there are reasonable grounds to believe that conflict-related sexual violence was used. So this is something that we have heard, but this is a definitive, the most definitive report really that we have had to date to show that this is what is believed to have happened. Now, we have had a denial from Hamas, as we have in the past, saying that these are unfounded lies. Also, the UN team, though, saying that they did have limited ability to carry this out, saying they didn't have the access that they wanted on the ground, in part because of mistrust, but also that they found it difficult to have forensic evidence that was professionally gathered at the time. So they did find some restrictions in what they were able to do. Also, this same team went to Ramallah in the occupied West Bank to hear allegations from both Palestinian men and women who had been incarcerating, saying that they alleged, quote, cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment. The mission said that they did have allegations made to them of these prisoners, saying that they had beatings, they had threats of rape against women, or threats of rape of female members of their family against the men, among other allegations that were made. We've put these allegations to the IDF. We are awaiting comment on them. Jim?
Wow. All right. That is very disturbing. Paula Hancock, thank you very much, and we'll be right back. Voters across the country headed to the polls today as Donald Trump eyes a possible Super Tuesday sweep to all but clinch the Republican nomination. Trump is on track to potentially win more primaries and caucuses than any previous Republican presidential candidate outside of an incumbent, an indication of his successful transformation of the GOP in his own image. Joining me now to discuss this, former Trump White House Deputy Press Secretary Sarah Matthews. Sarah, it's great to talk to you. I guess one of the things that we should get into is sort of what I was talking about with Adam Kinzinger earlier on in this program. I know that you resigned on January 6th. And what goes through your mind that on this Super Tuesday, Trump is basically on the verge, on the cusp of clinching the nomination? You won't clinch it today, but he's going to be very close.
Yeah, I think if you would have told me back on January 6, 2021, that just a couple years later we would find ourselves in this position, that he is still the leader of the Republican Party and is on his way toward clinching the Republican nomination, I would probably be shocked. And it's shocking because so many Republicans in the immediate aftermath of January 6th condemned Donald Trump for his efforts to try to overturn the election and his failure on January 6th. And now many of those people have kissed the ring and cozied up to him. And so it is disappointing. And I find a little bit of hope, though, in the fact that Nikki Haley is still in this race, that she's been able to win about 40% of the vote in some of the states that we've seen thus far. And it shows me that there is a growing shift in the Republican Party of folks who want to leave Donald Trump behind. But obviously, it's not enough. He still has this large hold on the base.
Yeah, and I mean, you bring up a good point. I mean, there's going to be a lot of pressure. You know, Trump world, there's going to be a lot of pressure on Nikki Haley to get out of this race after tonight. You think she should hang in there?
That's my hope. I hope that she stays in, honestly, until the convention, if she has the resources and has the ability to do so, because we don't know what could happen between now and the convention. We could see Donald Trump be convicted. And so who knows then what could happen at a convention. And so I really do hope that she'll stay in the race and continue to give voters another option, because right now, obviously, it looks like he is marching toward clinching the nomination, but there is still some time between now and the convention.
Yeah, and for the folks at home who have forgotten what was going on inside the White House, that I was inside the White House that day on January 6th, and I know you were part of the team that was trying to get Trump to basically talk down the rioters, to get them to stop doing what they were. For folks who forget all of this, what was going on that day?
Yeah, I was in the West Wing that day, as were you. We spoke that day, and I was doing everything in my power to try to get Donald Trump to stop the violence, because I knew that his supporters would only listen to him. And so I was talking to the people who I knew had his ear and telling them he needed to condemn the violence and he needed to tell these rioters to get away from the Capitol. And obviously, it took hours and hours and hours for him to do so, after he had many of his closest advisors begging and pleading with him. And so he reluctantly finally did. But that was already after much of the violence had already happened, and the Capitol Police had regained control of the building. And so it really didn't matter at that point then when he finally did speak up. And I think he didn't speak up because he was enjoying what was happening. He saw these people as fighting for him, and he wanted to do everything he could to stay in power. And so that was why I resigned that day. I felt uncomfortable with his efforts to try to overturn the election from the post-November moving on to January 6th. But obviously that day was a red line for me then.
Yeah. And I know, Sarah, that's why you're speaking out to this day, and we appreciate the time. Sarah Matthews, I hope we can continue this conversation in the days ahead. Thanks so much for joining us, and thanks to everybody else for joining us on this Super Tuesday morning. I'm Jim Acosta. Our next hour of Newsroom starts after a short break with Wolf Blitzer. That's next. Stay with us.
Super Tuesday is finally here. 16 states and American Samoa are casting ballots in their primary contests right now, as Donald Trump hopes to push Nikki Haley out of the race and officially start his rematch with President Biden. And Secretary of State Antony Blinken holds a high-stakes meeting with the Qatari Prime Minister in hopes of making headway on a ceasefire in Gaza. Hello, I'm Wolf Blitzer in Washington, and you're in the CNN Newsroom. Happening now across the country, Americans are heading to the polls and making their voices heard. At this hour, voting is underway in all 16 Super Tuesday states in what effectively could be the beginning of the end of the 2024 presidential primaries. Tonight, barring a major upset, the country will be one step closer to the contentious rematch that many Americans do not necessarily want. For Democrats, For many Americans, for Democrats in particular, President Biden's path to the nomination remains virtually unchallenged. But questions remain about whether voters disillusioned by his support for Israel will stay home. And on the Republican side, with more than one-third of the total delegates at stake, tonight could be Nikki Haley's last stand. As Trump inches closer to clinching the nomination, he's on track to win more primaries and caucuses than any non-incumbent Republican candidate in history. CNN has crews coast to coast staying on top of all these races. Let's start with CNN's Diane Gallagher. She's just outside Charlotte, North Carolina. Update our viewers where you are. Diane.
Yeah, Wolf, I am in beautiful Cornelius, North Carolina, where voters have been coming in steady here at the town hall precinct, casting their ballots not just for the top of the ticket, but also for a very healthy down ballot. Many races that they are choosing from governor to local offices. And we've been talking to very energized voters here in North Carolina who list issues like the border, education, abortion, and democracy as their top issues when they are pulling those ballots. Now, in North Carolina, you have to vote for what you are registered with, but there is a large number of unaffiliated registered voters, and they can choose whichever ballot they want when they go in to the polling place. And many of those individuals have told us they are choosing the Republican ballot today. I've talked to now several who say that they are using it as a form of protest vote against former President Trump.
I chose to vote Republican, but I'm an independent.
Who did you vote for? Do you mind me asking?
Nikki Haley.
Why?
Vote against Trump.
Do you feel that if Nikki Haley were the Republican nominee, she's someone you could vote for in a general election?
No. No, I would not vote for her either. I would vote Democrat.
This is a protest vote.
Yes.
Now, I've also talked to Trump voters here who chose a Republican ticket who tell me that they want to restore where they were 4 years ago, Wolf. Again, there are very important down ballot races here as well. And many of those voters tell me that education and the future of the state of North Carolina are what is on their mind when they go in and pull that ballot for them.
All right, Diane Gallagher in North Carolina for us. Thank you very much. Let's move out west right now. CNN's Brian Todd is joining us live from Utah, right near Salt Lake City. Brian, it's primary day. Democrats are headed to the polls, but Republicans there are doing something else. Tell us about that.
That's right, Wolf. Here in Utah today, it's a caucus format, not a primary format. They switched to a caucus format in 2016, and so the voters are not going to be getting here until later on this evening. The voters will arrive here at about 6 p.m. local time tonight. That's 8 p.m. Eastern time. First, let's set the scene for you. This is where the caucus site is. We're at the foot of the beautiful Wasatch Mountains. Take a look at that view here in Sandy, Utah. We are at Alta Vista High School at the foot of the Wasatch Mountains in Sandy, just south of Salt Lake City. This is the caucus site. Alta High School, a massive high school out here. The voters will be walking in the front entrance over here later on tonight. Again, they arrive here at 6 p.m. local time. That's 8 p.m. Eastern time. They register, they check in. They listen to some speeches. We are told that presidential surrogates will not be here speaking, but there will be surrogates for down ballot candidates like governor and senator speaking. So they'll be hearing some speeches, but the vote in earnest will start at 7 p.m. local time here. That's 9 p.m. Eastern time. The count will be about an hour later. So the votes will be coming in later on tonight from here in Utah, and it's pretty simple format. Here's a ballot. Take a look. You've got Ryan Binkley as one candidate, but then you have Nikki Haley and Donald Trump. It's a pretty easy ballot to fill in. They fill that in, then put it into a basket or some kind of a container, and they count them all up. That count will be taking place at about 8 p.m. local time, 10 p.m. Eastern time. 32 precincts are in here, so it's going to be a lot of voters, hundreds of voters coming in to take part in this caucus. They're going to be in 32 different rooms. Then they're going to be counting it in a separate room. We'll hopefully be able to bring that to you live and show it to our voters as it's happening. That's what makes the caucus format kind of so interesting and fun to cover, because it's so dynamic, and they'll give us access in here later on tonight to show all of it to our viewers. Wolf.
We will be watching together with you, Brian Todd. Thank you very much. Brian's in Utah. Let's discuss all of this with CNN political commentator and Democratic strategist Paul Begala, Republican strategist, the former RNC Communications Director Doug Heye, Republican strategist Sarah Longwell, and former Communications Director for Vice President Kamala Harris, Ashley Etienne. Paul, the voters, they will have their say today. What are you going to be watching for specifically?
I want to see how strong Trump is. He has shown weakness in these primaries that I did not suspect. I from the beginning, I still do think Trump's going to be the Republican nominee. But I had viewed him as this colossus within his party. Even in Iowa, which is probably the most conservative electorate we've had, 10% of all the Iowa Republican caucus attendees said they would vote for Biden over Trump. Trump only lost 6% of Republicans in the last election, and he still lost. He's losing 10, 20, 30, 40 in some of these primaries. He's not going to lose all of them to Joe Biden in the fall, believe me. But he's really showing some weakness that I'm surprised to see.
Doug, what are you going to be looking for?
That same thing, but especially with suburban voters. So Cornelius, North Carolina, where Diane is, about 20 miles north of Charlotte, outside of Lake Norman. A lot of suburban people who live there and work in Raleigh, especially suburban women. Well, if I was in North Carolina this weekend and went to Nikki Haley rally in Raleigh, and they had to move the venue to larger venues twice to accommodate crowd size, there's something happening within the Republican Party. Same thing's true with Democrats, as we saw in Michigan. But very clearly, voters are saying, we don't want to see this movie again. And there's weakness with both candidates. This is the movable object against the resistible force. And all polling says from voters, don't do this.
It's interesting because Trump's base, Sarah, is pretty solid, set in stone. But what about with suburban women, with more moderate Republicans out there? How's he likely to do?
Yeah, look, the number that I think about all the time now is 30%. It looks like about 70% of the Republican Party are just with Trump all the time. That's big. That's a big number. However, that 30%, where do you see it? You see 30% roughly who say if Trump is convicted of a crime, that they won't vote for him. 28% voted for Nikki Haley of self-ID'd Republicans, voted for Nikki Haley in Michigan, voted for her in South Carolina. And that 30% number is also the number of Republicans who do not think the election was stolen. And so that is the persuadable group that Donald Trump is really soft with. They want to move on from Trump. They don't like Trump. That's the part of the party we're really going for. And so I agree, he's weaker with that group, and that group includes a lot of suburban women, a lot of college-educated voters. That is who Trump has historically done really poorly with, and they're more out on him now than ever.
I'm anxious to get your thoughts, Ashley.
No, and I was going to say, and a sizable percentage of that 30% is saying that they wouldn't vote for Donald Trump under any set of circumstances. And that's the problem. That number was upwards of 250,000 people in Michigan. That really sways an election. So I think, one thing that's not, to Paul's point, is being put a spotlight on is Donald Trump's current vulnerabilities. Not only is there a lack of enthusiasm beyond his base, but he's underwater in terms of his fundraising. There's questions about whether or not he can bring in Nikki Haley's voters. If she runs the course, she continues to put a spotlight on these vulnerabilities for him and really sort of make the case that Republicans really have no other choice other than stay home or go Joe Biden.
Let me get Doug to weigh in on that specific point. How vulnerable is Trump in a rematch with Biden right now?
Well, they're both vulnerable. That's the reality, and it's why voters are saying we don't want any of this. Democrats I talked to, emails I had this morning about the New Yorker article with Biden, very scared that Biden can't win. I talked to a lot of Republicans who aren't pure Trump Republicans, that the glorious leader is always right, who are saying we've got real problems here as well. And it's why this electorate, I think, is so nervous moving forward. And it's why tonight's interesting, because of all the states that are in there, North Carolina and Virginia are sort of the only two that are swing states. Watching those results, North Carolina is going to come in pretty late, by the way. Those are going to be interesting for November.
Because I asked the question because Nikki Haley spent a lot of time at a public event arguing against Trump's electability. I want you and our viewers to listen to this.
At some point, maybe we should say the reason that America keeps losing is because of Donald Trump. In order to change it, it's going to take a lot of courage. Courage from everybody here. Courage for me to run. And courage for every one of you to know, don't complain about what happens in a general election if you don't vote in this primary.
So that's exactly what I heard her say in Raleigh on Saturday. And she also makes the point that it's not just about her. If she's going to win, if Donald Trump could win, he could lose. It's pretty close. All the polls seem to be in the margin. Nikki Haley wins with big margins, and that means governors, senators, school boards, members of Congress. If Republicans want to have a big night, she's making the case. She's that person for the big night come November.
What do you think, Sarah?
Yeah, look, I think that what Nikki Haley does next is actually the most interesting question because her rhetoric against Trump right now, she's really turned it up. And I think Nikki Haley has got to burn the boats. This Republican Party has moved away from candidates like Nikki Haley. I think she's right. I think she would, in a general election, she would win by huge margins. But she's not going to win this Republican primary. She's just not, because the Republican Party...
You think she'll drop out after tonight?
I do think she's going to probably drop out after this, and I think my wholehearted hope is that she does not endorse Donald Trump, because that would build a permission structure for all of the Republicans that she has been talking to who really like her, where she's been making the case about how unfit he is. It gives them permission to say, well, I don't want to vote for Joe Biden, so I'll go ahead and vote for Donald Trump. If she withholds her endorsement, her criticisms against Trump stand, and they do real damage to him.
On the Democratic side, Ashley, what stands out to you, the dynamics going into tonight?
I think there's a couple of questions for the president. One is, where is this uncommitted vote going to land? I mean, the protesters coming out of Michigan said that they were going to take it to the other states and all the way to the convention.
Are they doing that?
That's the real question, whether or not they...
I don't see a lot of organized opposition to Biden in these other states where they can vote uncommitted like they did in Michigan.
Yeah, and I think that is the question, whether or not. But beyond that, I think he's in a strong position. We're not giving him enough credit. Again, he's outraising the RNC, outraising Donald Trump. He's got an incredible record. You compare that to the Republican side. They're wrong on the issues that are going to drive out voters, from abortion to guns and crime, those other issues. But I think the president is in a strong position going into tonight. Again, turnout's up so far. That's a good sign for him. But otherwise, I think he's in a good position.
Very quickly, Paul, button this up.
Joe Biden has got to boost enthusiasm with young people and people of color. That's the heart and soul of the Democratic Party. Particularly, actually, for him, his problem is with black men and Hispanic men, far more than women. But he's got to boost that enthusiasm, and he's got to do it. He'll do it in the campaign trail, but Thursday night, State of the Union. I'm watching to see how he speaks to those folks.
We'll see how he does. All right, guys, thank you to all of you very, very much. Stay with CNN as we follow all the races on this Super Tuesday. I'll be back 4 p.m. Eastern alongside Kate Baldwin for our special coverage. Still ahead this hour, the race to replace the Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell is heating up big time right now. But with the Republican Party's identity in major transition, where should the next leader stand? We'll go live to Capitol Hill. Plus, Secretary of State Antony Blinken just met with the Prime Minister of Qatar and said there is an opportunity for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. In minutes, he's going to be talking to an Israeli war cabinet official and a major rival to Prime Minister Netanyahu, who might be able to actually move that forward. And when Elon Musk took over Twitter, he immediately fired several top executives. Today, they're asking a judge to get them their severance pay. Stay with us. You're live right here in the CNN newsroom. Right now here in Washington, there are very high-level talks to try to forge a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas nearly 5 months into the war. The Israeli War Cabinet member Benny Gantz just wrapped up a meeting with Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. Gantz is a political rival of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and Israel is making it clear that Gantz is not representing the Israeli government during his trip to the United States. Gantz is also set to meet with Secretary of State Antony Blinken, and just a short time ago, Blinken met with his Qatari counterpart to talk about a possible ceasefire. Lots of meetings with a lot at stake today. CNN's chief national security correspondent Alex Marquardt is here with me. Alex, there are so many parts. What do you expect to emerge from all these meetings?
Yeah, a series of really important high-level meetings today, Wolf. First, with the Qataris, this was supposed to be a conversation about what they call the strategic dialogue, but it is clear from listening to what the two gentlemen said before that meeting that the focus really is on getting to a ceasefire and getting more aid into Gaza. Certainly there's an emphasis on getting the ceasefire done, which Qatar has been helping with. But Secretary of State Antony Blinken making clear that even if that doesn't happen, more aid needs to be allowed into Gaza, that Israel has to open up more crossings. Israel so far has refused to do that. That's why we've seen these airdrops taking place over the last few days by the U.S. and Jordan. And that is something that Benny Gantz will have been hearing throughout his meetings, the importance of getting more aid into Gaza. As you noted, he had meetings today with both the Secretaries of Defense and the Secretary of State. The Biden administration essentially rolling out the red carpet for one of Benjamin Netanyahu's biggest rivals. That is certain to anger Prime Minister Netanyahu, but the U.S. administration now putting a lot of pressure on Israel to get more aid into Gaza, to get it where it needs to be as the humanitarian situation gets even worse by the day.
And Qatar plays such a significant role because it does have good connections, good relations with Hamas.
They host Hamas. And so they have been at the middle of these negotiations about how to get to a ceasefire. And it is clear that the negotiators are still trying to work to get this deal across the line, essentially to get Israel and Hamas on the same page. Where it stands now, Wolf, is the Biden administration is saying that Israel has essentially already agreed to the framework and the ball is in Hamas's court. Israel has been demanding a list of the hostages who are alive and those who are dead, so they know who they will be able to get out in a hostage exchange. So far, Hamas has not given that list, and there have been conversations in Cairo over the past few days to get this ceasefire done. Israel did not attend those meetings, and just yesterday we heard from the foreign minister of Egypt, who says that there's still work to be done. The administration wants to get this done by Ramadan, which starts early next week.
Yeah, let's hope that happens. It would be important, especially if those hostages can go home. Mari, thanks very much, Alex, for that. The ceasefire talks continue on the heels of a new and very disturbing report from the United Nations. It says hostages held in Gaza have been sexually abused.
We found clear and convincing information that sexual violence, including rape, sexualized torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, has been committed against captives. And we also have reasonable grounds to believe that such violence may still be ongoing against those still held in captivity.
The UN report comes after a UN team actually visited Israel to analyze and verify information on conflict-related sexual violence during and after the October 7th Hamas attacks. CNN's Bianna Golodriga has been following this story very closely. She's joining us right now. Bianna, what was the big takeaway from this UN report?
There were quite a few takeaways, Wolf. Look, this was an important report because it finally should shut the door to anyone who's questioning the reports of sexual violence committed on that day and after. Now, Pramila Patten, who's the UN Special Envoy on Sexual Violence in Conflict, had spent 2.5 weeks on a fact-finding mission in Israel and speaking with over 30 people, independent organizations, government organizations, going through 5,000 photographs, and also came to this conclusion. There are reasonable grounds to believe that conflict-related sexual violence occurred during the October 7th attacks in multiple locations across Gaza periphery, including rape and gang rape in at least 3 locations. In addition to that, Wolf, as we played already, what's really important to highlight is there's ongoing concern that the hostages that remain in Gaza, especially the women, are vulnerable to ongoing sexual assault and violence, given the conclusions that she's reached, which is why the UN is calling for a ceasefire to allow the release of these hostages as soon as possible, because that is a big concern, given the mounting evidence that they've accumulated independently now, in addition to Israeli investigations and what we've heard from witnesses and from other hostages that have been released. There's a lot of concern right now, Wolf, about what is happening in Gaza to those hostages, especially the females that remain in captivity.
You know, it's interesting because the UN team also, Bianna, looked into allegations that Palestinians being held in detention in the West Bank are also being subjected to various forms of sexual violence. What more can you tell us about that?
So this part of the report actually came later. This was not part of the initial fact-finding mission, because the dates that were secured and the allegations that were already in place prior to Pramila Patten's visit did not include these allegations. So here's what she said, because she did visit the occupied West Bank during this trip, and she said in her report, quote, "Some forms of sexual violence against Palestinian men and women in detention settings during house raids at checkpoints were reported, though the mission team did not visit Gaza. The office will continue to monitor the situation." So this is something that they included in the report, but something that Pramila Patten said needs to be further investigated. Israeli authorities are already saying that this is part of their internal investigation as well. So obviously we'll continue to follow this story. But Wolf, if I could just end on this, though they did note that there were multiple locations where there was rape, there was gang rape, horrific events that they say there's enough evidence to suggest that they indeed happened. What is really upsetting and tragic in a lot of rape situations, especially in a wartime setting, is that they may never get to the complete conclusion and bottom of just how prevalent this was and how widespread this was. They were hoping that witnesses could come forward. They did speak to witnesses, though they did note that they were not able to speak to any survivors of sexual assault. Sadly, we know that most of them had been killed, but even those that had survived did not feel comfortable enough to come forward. That is not unusual given the circumstances, but I'd like to play sound from Pramila about what she said about the importance to continue this investigation.
The true prevalence of sexual violence during the 7th of October attacks and their aftermath may take months or years to emerge and may never be fully known, given that sexual violence remains a chronically underreported crime in every conflict-affected setting.
So, Wolf, the investigation continues. Again, to reiterate, what's really important here is that you have an independent body, a third party, that has been in Israel for about 2.5 weeks investigating all of these claims, and once and for all, that should shut the door to anyone, any serious person really doubting these horrific, horrific allegations and crimes.
They are certainly horrific. Bianca Ladriga, thanks for all your excellent reporting on this very important issue. We appreciate it very, very much. And we'll be right back with a lot more news. For years, John Thune has been at Mitch McConnell's side as the two men shaped and shepherded the Republican agenda in the U.S. Senate. But now the Republican whip from South Dakota is hoping to take center stage. Thune is officially announcing his bid to replace McConnell as the party's leader. CNN's Lauren Fox is joining us right now. Lauren, as the number 2 Republican, Thune is considered by some as McConnell's successor. But with the conference getting more and more fractured, could that actually hurt his chances?
Yeah, we're still months away, Wolf, from this race really taking shape. And in a lot of ways, it's wide open. Republican senators still have a long way to go before many of them will make up their minds about who they think should succeed Mitch McConnell as the Republican leader. And so far, you have 2 men who are jumping into this race. John Cornyn, who previously served as the Republican whip, and John Thune, who currently serves as the Republican whip. As you noted, Thune has worked really closely with McConnell over the course of the last several years. But before that, Senator John Cornyn worked very closely with Mitch McConnell when he was in the number 2 slot. We did get some news this morning, though. John Barrasso, a member of Republican leadership, has decided he will not run for Republican leader. Instead, he will run for that number 2 slot as the Republican whip, as Thune and Cornyn are now facing off in that leadership race. So a lot of moving parts happening right now as people are moving up, as people are ascending within the conference. You're starting to see those lower tier races also take shape. In this case, Barrasso announcing he's going to run for that number 2 slot.
Yeah, all significant races indeed. Senator Rick Scott, who lost a bid to unseat McConnell after the 2022 midterms, is set to hold a press conference today ahead of a lot of speculation. He may also get into this race. Last night, he met with Donald Trump over at Mar-a-Lago. How much influence could Trump have in this Senate leadership race?
Well, certainly that is one of the key questions going into this race dynamic over the next several months. One thing to keep in mind, though, Wolf, is that this is a secret ballot election, which means lawmakers will go behind closed doors to cast their votes. And despite the fact that Trump may have tweets, despite the fact that Trump may post on Truth Social or make his preferences known, no one will ultimately know how each individual senator actually votes when they go into that room to cast their ballots. And you hear from a lot of Republican senators saying that despite the fact that they trust or they have confidence in Donald Trump, they also argue this is about the Republican conference. This is about individual senators making a decision about who should be serve as their leader. This is not a moment for Trump to really exert his influence. So it's a huge open question right now, Wolf.
Lauren Fox on Capitol Hill, thank you very much. And when we come back, it's the busiest day in the primary season as Donald Trump hopes to sweep Nikki Haley off the campaign trail and out of the race. Stay with us. You're in the CNN newsroom.
Today.
Voters across the country are headed to the polls today as Donald Trump eyes a possible Super Tuesday sweep to all but clinch the Republican presidential nomination. Trump could end up winning more primaries and caucuses than any previous Republican presidential candidate who wasn't an incumbent. It's an indication that he is successfully transforming the GOP. CNN senior political analyst and Atlantic senior editor Ron Brownstein is joining us right now. Ron, you just wrote an excellent article for CNN.com. As we watch voters head to the polls today, how do you see Trump's grip fundamentally changing the GOP?
Yeah, Wolf. I think the primaries so far have sent us an important dual message about the state of the Republican coalition. As you say, the clearest message is that this is Donald Trump's party. his coalition is the largest faction in the GOP. And if you look at the way elected officials are behaving, especially the younger ones elected since Trump's emergence, it's likely that he is going to be the dominant figure in this party for a while. For example, virtually all of the Republican senators elected since 2018 voted against the aid to Ukraine, a rejection of kind of the Reagan-era view about America's role in the world, symbolized by Mitch McConnell, who is stepping aside. But having said that, what the primaries are also showing is that there is a meaningful slice of the GOP coalition that remains resistant to this vision. A quarter, a third, maybe higher in some states where Nikki Haley has had the time and money to campaign. But there is a portion of Republicans who are uneasy about this, who feel disconnected from it. And the question remains whether Biden can harvest any of that into support for himself in November, given their doubts about him as well.
In your important article, Ron, you also write this, and I'm quoting you now, in important ways, Trump is a different candidate than he was in 2016. This time, he's much stronger among and more reliant on the party's most conservative elements. What does that mean heading toward a general election in November?
Yeah, he's more ideologically defined in the primaries than he was last time. In 2016, there really wasn't much difference in his support between moderates, somewhat conservative, and very conservative voters. There wasn't much difference between voters who were not evangelicals and those who were. Now those gaps are much bigger. Trump is much more reliant on evangelical voters, much stronger among very conservative voters. And the biggest divide that we saw in 2016, which was education, is even bigger this time. Trump's support among non-college Republicans is overwhelming. I mean, around 70% so far in most of these states. But among college-educated voters, he is still facing much more resistance. And that really is, as I say, Nikki Haley is leaving a trail of breadcrumbs for Joe Biden about where he can go. It's the same kind of voters that we saw in 2018, 2020, and 2022 reject Republicans and move toward the Democrats. Why Biden became the first Democrat since Harry Truman in 1948 to win Maricopa County and Phoenix, suburban white-collar voters. The difference, of course, is now these voters have had a 4-year exposure to Biden and his record, and they are very negative on him. So how these double negative voters, these Republican-leaning voters in many cases, white-collar voters who are down on Trump but also down on Biden, how they sort out is obviously going to be critical in November.
As you know, we could see Trump all but clinch the presidential nomination on the Republican side later today. But the question of what will happen to Nikki Haley's voters in a general election certainly remains. What do you think happens?
Well, look, at least 60% of her voters in each of the first 3 states, Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina, said in the AP VoteCast study they would not vote for Trump in a general election. 80% of them in our exit polls for Edison Research say that he is not, at least in each state, that he is not fit to be president if he's convicted of a crime. Now, I have not met a strategist in either party who believe nearly that many of them in the end would abandon Trump. But if even a meaningful slice do, that becomes a problem. And as I said, the question is, the challenge for Biden is that many of those voters are negative on his performance as well. They like the economy better under Trump, and he really has to focus their choice on the issues where they have the most hesitation about Trump. The idea that he is a threat to their rights on issues like abortion, to their values, and to democracy itself. Of course, Biden faces, Wolf, as you know, the reverse problem, which is that he is looking at historic defection at this point among Black and Hispanic voters. Trump is, in the polling that's come out this weekend, double, I think, the share that any Republican has had among Black voters, and he's in the 40s among Hispanics. Whether Trump can sustain that all the way to November is a question, but there's no doubt that both coalitions now are showing some fractures.
Good point. Ron Brownstein, thank you very, very much. Happening now, the jury selection is underway in the involuntary manslaughter trial of the Michigan high school shooter's father. You'll remember the teen's mother was convicted last month. Stay with us. You're in the CNN newsroom. In Michigan, jury selection is underway for the father of the teenage gunman at Oxford High School. James Crumbley faces 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter, 1 count for each of the students his son murdered back in 2021. His wife was convicted last month on all 4 counts. CNN's Gene Cazares is joining us right now. Gene, how will the trial of James Crumbley differ from that of his wife?
Well, it will differ because the emphasis is going to be different. James Crumbley is the one that purchased that gun for his son, and there was no secret. It was an early Christmas present, a 9mm Sig Sauer gun. And his name is the registered owner. He's on the receipt, so he is in control of the care, the custody, and the safekeeping of that gun. That's going to be really, I think, Exhibit A for the prosecution. Also, that text that Ethan wrote to his friend in his bedroom one night as they were texting back and forth, he and his friend, he said, you know, I really asked my dad for mental health treatment. I need help. But he laughed at me, told me to suck it up and take a pill. Well, the defense fought hard to not get that into this trial because they say, look, you have a right to confront your witnesses. We can't confront a text. They did not win. That is coming in. And so the only way I think the defense can really work around that is to put James Crumbley on the stand. Alternatively, it could be argument. But I think another issue that has come up is that the prosecution wanted, and they are getting, 2 more witnesses in this trial. Number one of the students that was shot but not killed. And from sitting in that courtroom during Ethan Crumbley's hearings, that is emotional testimony to see a minor, a child, talk about getting shot. Secondly, the previous gun owner of that 9mm is going to take the stand. That was a used gun that James Crumbley purchased. And he's going to testify that he got a cable lock with it. We already know a cable lock came with the gun that James Crumbley purchased. We don't ever see it being used in any picture. So prosecution's going to have that. But I think one big thing, I just have to leave you with this. The defense really wanted to change the venue because, Wolf, you just said it was about a month ago that Jennifer Crumbley was convicted in that same courthouse, in that same courtroom. Community is infused with this guilty verdict. And they said, Your Honor, we need to go to another city in Michigan. The judge refused. So jury selection today to get that jury is right in the same community.
All right, Gene Casara is reporting for us. Thank you very much. Just ahead, a satellite that detects methane is about to begin its patrol from space. We'll explain. That's next. Fossil fuel companies and governments are on notice. A brand new satellite will now be tracking methane gas emissions around the globe. CNN chief climate correspondent Bill Weir has more.
3, 2, 1, ignition, and liftoff, Falcon 9.
Paid for by the likes of billionaire Jeff Bezos and other donors, the nonprofit Environmental Defense Fund just launched a new kind of eye in the sky.
Vehicle is supposed to be downrange.
Methane Sat is designed to circle the Earth every 95 minutes or so, and with cutting-edge detail, spot plumes and leaks of planet-cooking pollution long associated with the production of natural gas. If carbon dioxide is a blanket of average thickness overheating the Earth for centuries, methane is like a blanket 7 feet thick, with over 80 times the heat-trapping power of CO2 for about 2 decades after its release. Sometimes it leaks from old equipment or orphan wells, and sometimes when there's no one to buy it, companies just burn it in a practice known as flaring.
What we found here in the Permian Basin is that operators are wasting enough gas to heat about 2 million homes a year.
In 2021, EDF took us up over the oil and gas fields of Texas to sniff out methane leakers with a specially equipped airplane.
So this is carbon dioxide down here? Yeah. And this is methane.
But now they can fly over every oil and gas basin in the world, where 80% of global supplies are fracked and pumped.
We can basically create a movie of what's going on with respect to methane emissions. Before, we could just take snapshots when we had a plane in the air and we can get permission to fly. This is a whole new game. It really creates an enormous leap forward in our ability to really understand greenhouse gas emissions.
While other satellites can spot methane, what they find is often kept private. But EDF says that in about 18 months, their data will be open and free on Google Earth Engine for anyone to see.
You just have a real clarity now, a clarity we've never had before. And I think people realize you don't have to accept what somebody says, whether that's a government or a company. You can actually directly look at it, see what it is, and that is completely different than anything we've ever had for greenhouse gases. What I refer to is we're going to have radical transparency.
And what has been the response from big oil and gas companies that you're doing this?
Well, I think many of the companies see this as a real opportunity because they really do believe, and I suspect they're right, that they're doing a good job, but many of them aren't. It gives countries and companies the tools to select who they buy gas from and where that gas comes from. So the first time they'll have the ability to make really informed decisions, and those informed decisions will have an enormous positive impact on the climate.
Our thanks to Bill Weir for that report. Before we go, a very quick and special thanks to one of our many loyal viewers for watching. Breaking news this morning, the United States Supreme Court ruling that former President Donald Trump cannot be removed from any state's ballot.
I think the real breaking news here is Wolf Blitzer and I appear to be merging. We are becoming one.
I want to just say this to John. Welcome to the Wolfpack and very nice glasses. I'll be back later today with Kate Baldwin, 4 p.m. Eastern, for special coverage of Super Tuesday. Inside Politics with Dana Bash starts right now.
Today on Inside Politics, it's a Tuesday to remember. Americans in more than a dozen states across the country are casting their ballots this Super Tuesday. The decisions could end the primary season and all but hand the Republican nomination to Donald Trump for a third straight election. Plus, is this Nikki Haley's last stand? She's on the verge of mathematical elimination. So what's her next move? And more importantly, where will her supporters land? And 4 years ago on Super Tuesday, Joe Biden pulled off a staggering political comeback. This time, he's an incumbent president preparing for a rematch with monumental consequences. We'll look at warning signs for both men with 8 months to go until the general election. I'm Dana Bash. Let's go behind the headlines and inside politics. First up, it is the biggest primary day of 2024, and it could end with the general election matchup that most Americans say they don't want. 865 Republican delegates are up for grabs in 15 states across all time zones. Right now, Donald Trump has 276 delegates. The magic number to look for is 1,215, which means as of tonight, the former president could be on the cusp of having the delegates he needs to clinch the nomination. CNN has full team coverage on this crucial day. Kristen Holmes is in Palm Beach, Florida, where Donald Trump is hosting an election night party. And Kylie Atwood is in Charleston, South Carolina, where Nikki Haley is spending the day. Kristen, I want to start with you. What are you hearing from your sources inside the Trump camp?
Dana, Trump's team feels very confident going into today. They believe that while they know he's not going to be the nominee after tonight, that he's going to get enough wins he could possibly be the nominee by next week. And by that, I mean cross that delegate threshold. And that was really on full display when Donald Trump did an interview with Fox this morning. Take a listen.
I want everybody to come together. We're going to have a unified party because our real opponent happens to be named Biden. There's no path for her to win. Whether she likes hearing that or not, there's no path for her to win, no matter what.
So one thing I want to focus on is him saying there's a unified party, because this has really been part of the annoyance on Trump's team that Haley hasn't dropped out. They understand that there are some people who are just never going to back Donald Trump, even Republicans who are never going to back Donald Trump. But they do believe that there is a section of Republicans, of conservative voters, who are still looking for an alternative, so haven't gotten behind the former president. They want those people to come behind him before they pivot into this general election, because they know that no matter what happens, it's going to be an incredibly tight election, between a rematch between President Joe Biden and Donald Trump, and they are going to need all the support, every single vote that they can possibly get. So what they're focused on right now is how to get those people who are maybe still looking at Haley to come behind Donald Trump as they start looking ahead to November.
Yeah, we're going to look at some of those numbers in a minute. I don't know who's going to win tonight, but you, Kristen, and Kylie, who we're about to get to, are tied for the best live chat locations of the day. That is for sure. Kristen, thank you. Kylie, let's show them what we're talking about. You are in Charleston, South Carolina. Nikki Haley is home there in South Carolina. She does not have any events planned tonight. I was talking to her on the show on Friday asking which Super Tuesday state she was going to be in, she said she would be back home. What does that tell us?
Well, listen, the fact that she wants to be here in her home state is telling. She wants to be with those close to her. This is not a state that is voting today. Let's just remind folks, South Carolina already had its primary a few weeks ago. And when Nikki Haley's asked about the longevity of her campaign beyond Super Tuesday, she often says that she's not thinking that far ahead. Her campaign's last scheduled rally was last night in Texas. Of course, they could schedule more, but there aren't any more on the calendar as of now. And she was asked earlier this morning on Fox if she will drop out if she doesn't have a successful showing tonight. She didn't commit one way or another, but she was very protective of her supporters. Listen to what she said.
I don't know why everybody's so adamant that they have to follow Trump's lead to get me out of this race. You know, all of these people deserve to vote. 16 states want to have their voices heard. They don't want to be ignored. They don't want to be just said that that's nothing. They're actually quite something, and they want something different in our country, and I respect them tremendously for that.
Now, back in January, around the time of the New Hampshire primary, Nikki Haley's campaign pointed to Super Tuesday presenting fertile ground for them because 11 of the 16 states and territories voting today have open or semi-open primaries. But when Nikki Haley was asked if she's relying on Democrats and independents to boost her today, she said no. She pointed to the fact that only 5% of her supporters here in South Carolina were Democrats. So she has certainly not been trying to speak specifically to Democrats and independents, though we know that moderates have really boosted her along the way here. And another thing to watch, Dana, is that over the weekend, Haley indicated that she no longer feels bound by the commitment she made last summer to support the eventual Republican nominee. She said that the RNC now is a different RNC than it was when she made that pledge. And she gave another reason today for not feeling bound to that pledge, saying that Trump never signed the pledge. And so therefore, she doesn't have to necessarily uphold that pledge. She says it will be her decision as to if she will support that eventual nominee or not. But right now, her and her team are really focused on what happens in all these states on Super Tuesday.
Yeah, and she clearly feels that she has some leverage when it comes to where her supporters may go. And you could see that in the way that she is answering those questions differently than she has in the past. Thank you so much, Kylie, from beautiful Charleston. Appreciate that. I want to talk about all of this with my great panel on the Super Tuesday, the Washington Post's Isaac Arnsdorf, Margaret Talev of Axios, and Bloomberg's Mario Parker. I don't know, Margaret, when we were coming on air, she said, does it feel like Super Tuesday? I'm going to actually now, after listening to them, I'm going to go with yes. Okay.
But it was touch and go for a while.
What are you looking for today, Margaret?
Well, I mean, look, we all know where the numbers are going. Even if Donald Trump doesn't hit those numbers tonight, he's on a path that seems irreversible. A few things I'm watching for. Obviously, in Virginia, those results are going to be important. They're going to tell us quite a bit about how college-educated suburban and ex-urban voters and around metro areas feel about the fall lines in this race and whether they can stomach another Trump term or whether they really want an alternative. So that will give us some clues.
North Carolina is similar.
Yes. North Carolina is interesting for so many reasons. Mm-hmm. This is, Democrats hoped it would be the most battlegroundy of Trump states. I'm not sure it's tracking that way, but the governor's race is going to be very interesting, especially if the current lieutenant governor becomes the Republican nominee for governor. So we'll be watching that contest. And then, of course, in the California Senate race, I think that's the other race we'll be watching, on the Democratic side.
Yeah. No, that's a fascinating one for sure. Isaac, you are on the campaign trail with Donald Trump a lot, exclusively maybe. So I want to ask about some of the things that Kristen was touching on about how the Trump campaign is looking not just at what the results tonight tell them, but also kind of big picture, assuming that he is the nominee, how he gets some of the Nikki Haley voters back. And the New York Times poll over the weekend told us a lot of interesting things about the national snapshot right now. One of them, everyone focused on Biden and what it said about Biden, but there's a lot in here about Donald Trump as well. Question is whether or not Republican primary voters, how they feel about Donald Trump being the nominee. 48% enthusiastic, 32% satisfied, but 18% are either dissatisfied or angry. So if you look at that and against that backdrop, listen to what Donald Trump said about people who aren't, quote unquote, MAGA. He said it over the weekend in Virginia.
I'm lucky that I'm able to explain it to the public, because if you weren't able to explain it, the public wouldn't know. They'd believe what they see. So I don't want to win this way. Look, I want to win based on my policies are better. We're going to cut taxes. We're going to get interest rates down. They say, always trying to demean, well, MAGA really represents 48% of the Republican Party. No, it represents 96% and maybe 100%. We're getting rid of the Romneys of the world. We want to get Romneys and those out.
The Romneys of the world still exist, and they're going to be put in a position of having to choose from three choices. Trump, Biden, I mean, I guess there are others if they live in a state where there's an independent on the ballot, or stay home. What are you hearing from people in the Trump camp about statements like that from their candidate?
Well, and that's really the argument that Nikki Haley is making, is that she is representing a significant constituency here that is not going to go away.
But he's not exactly courting them with those statements.
Well, he's... You know, if you look back to New Hampshire, when it was all about, it was supposed to be his night, and he was so mad about what Haley did that it was all about her, versus Michigan, when he came out and he didn't mention Haley at all. And so they've been trying to look ahead to the general, focus on Biden, just ignore Haley, make her go away. But you're not seeing a ton of, short of maybe letting off the attacks on Haley, you're not seeing a ton of outreach toward the voters who Haley is speaking to, and those voters who you heard Haley talking about, energizing her to want to stay in the race.
And yeah, to Isaac's point, I mean, I think if you look at one of the questions right now is, what does Haley do from here, right? She doesn't have the delegate math to go forward, et cetera. But if you look really closely, what she is doing is, to your point, Dana, creating some leverage, right? Donald Trump, the art of the deal, et cetera, bringing that to the table. We know that he's bleeding support in the suburbs among independents, et cetera. He's going to need the full coalition of the Republican Party in November. No matter whether she has 15% of that slice, 10% of that slice, when she could go to the table at Mar-a-Lago and say, hey, I may or may not endorse you, what can you give me in return?
And then let's look at the other side of the aisle, the Democrats. And the New York Times had a story today that kind of encapsulates some of the frustration by the president and his team. And the headline is, do Americans have a collective amnesia about Donald Trump? The frenetic pace of the Trump years meant many Americans made Trump news an obsessive habit or tuned it out completely. The rat-a-tat volume coincided with the continued rise of algorithm-driven social media and shrinking attention spans. That environment created a kind of numbness that not even 91 felony counts or enormous civil penalties for defamation and fraud can break through.
Yeah, if the Biden camp is frustrated about not being able to get their economic message through, point B, option B, or bullet point B, is the fact that they just can't believe that Americans don't have the same type of angst around Donald Trump that they had in 2020. What's important to remember in 2020 was that election was held in the backdrop of a pandemic, the most impactful racial reckoning in the country in about 50, 60 years as well. And they just can't seem to stir that angst against Donald Trump. There's this sepia view among the electorate, and we see that borne out in polls as well, where they're not hitting Donald Trump for presiding over COVID. Instead, they're remembering those low gas prices that were attributed to the lower demand during COVID.
And that's the amnesia that they're talking about. And Margaret, the other obvious difference, to be completely Captain Obvious here, is that Joe Biden has been president for 4 years, and they see him through that lens, and they see him through his approval numbers have gone down, as some incumbents tend to deal with when there are tough times. And so he's the opponent to Donald Trump, not just the former vice president who's been a private citizen for 4 years.
That's it. I think you can look at the lessons of 2016 and say that one of the mistakes that the Democrats made was spending too much energy talking about why it shouldn't be Trump and not enough energy articulating the case for yourself. You don't want to repeat that mistake. On the other hand, you don't have a race where voters are essentially seeing President Biden and former President Donald Trump as two incumbents running against each other, which is like, that's a weird thing to say, but that's what it is. It's a race against two incumbents. And Trump's advantage is not that people love his chaos or his legal stuff or the way he treats people or his personal, like all these things. It's that their memory goes back to a time either pre-COVID or early COVID where many rank and file voters felt like they had more money in their pocket at the end of the day. And that against the current specter of inflation, you could talk about how the stock market's doing and unemployment rate, but the bottom line is the prices of goods every day are in people's heads. Yep. And Joe Biden has not figured out the psychology of how to message that and how to tell people, look, you need to compare apples and oranges, or you're not going to get what you think you're going to get. Like, he has not figured out how to make that case. Yeah. And you've got two candidates very weakened by their own problems, grasping onto the weaknesses of the other to have them.
Very, very well said. Well, he's got 8 months to figure it out. Up next, we talked about Nikki Haley. Will she win anywhere tonight? We're going to take you out west to one of her best opportunities and look at the road ahead for Trump's last challenger standing.
It's not normal for Donald Trump to pick the side of a tyrant over our allies. It's not normal for Donald Trump to go and pay $60 million in campaign contributions towards his personal court cases. It's not normal for Donald Trump to continue to mock the military. And it's not normal when Joe Biden calls his opponents fascists and Donald Trump calls his opponents vermin. None of that is normal.
That was Nikki Haley in Texas last night in what could have been her final campaign rally. Now, she's not planning a Super Tuesday speech tonight, as we discussed with Kylie Atwood. She has no other campaign events on her schedule. It will be a decisive night for her campaign. Let's head out west to Utah, which in the past has been a little bit less, I would say a lot less Trumpy than other deep red states. That's where CNN's Brian Todd is. Brian, what's the mood there? Do people on the ground there feel more of affinity or more pull to Nikki Haley, or is this maybe going to be more of the same and what we expect to see in other states tonight?
Well, Dana, that's a good question, and it's kind of an unknown here because Donald Trump has gotten lukewarm support here in Utah in past caucuses and past elections. First, I'll set the scene for you. We are at the foot of the beautiful Wasatch Mountains here. Take a look at that view here in Sandy, Utah. This is the caucus site that we're going to be covering tonight. This is Alta High School here in Sandy, just south of Salt Lake City. This is a place where 32 precincts are going to be holding a vote tonight, and the voters won't even start gathering here for almost 8 hours at about 6 p.m. local time, 8 p.m. Eastern time. 32 precincts and 32 different rooms are going to be caucusing just inside those doors there, and we're going to be covering it live. You mentioned Nikki Haley's support here. Here's her advantage here. We talked about Trump's lukewarm support here in past elections. Donald Trump lost the 2016 caucus here in Utah handily to Ted Cruz. That wasn't even close. Also, Nikki Haley has picked up some support here. She campaigned here last week. The governor of Utah, Spencer Cox, says he doesn't like Trump or Biden as candidates. He does like Nikki Haley, but he has not fully endorsed her yet. But his wife, Abby Cox, has endorsed Nikki Haley. The Lieutenant Governor, Deirdre Henderson, has endorsed Nikki Haley. So those are Haley's advantages in addition to the Mitt Romney factor. Mitt Romney, of course, the retiring U.S. Senator, still a very popular figure here and has been, of course, very harshly critical of Donald Trump for years. So will the Mitt Romney factor play into this, and will Haley's support elsewhere play into this? That could happen. The advantage that Donald Trump has here tonight is that this is a a party-run caucus here. The Republican Party is running the caucus. That tends to draw more kind of committed Republican voters, and those tend to be a little bit more conservative. So Donald Trump may have the advantage there tonight. We're going to see how it all plays out, and we'll be able to show it to a lot of our viewers live when the vote's being counted here, Dana.
Okay, I would say you're maybe runner-up for best live shot location of the day. Not what you said. What you said was amazing. We're just talking about the backdrop. I'm kidding. It's gorgeous there. Thank you so much, Brian. Appreciate your reporting. Let's get back to our panel and talk more about the Nikki Haley of it all tonight. And let's just look at the numbers, the math problem, Isaac, that she has. 865 delegates at stake tonight, but when you look at what's going to be awarded by the end of tonight, 421 in winner-take-all states, 195 in winner-take-all congressional districts, 238 proportional delegates. So assuming that Donald Trump gets the vast majority of that, and remember it's 12-15.
Well, we've been doing that
Yeah.
for weeks already, and
But we've been doing it for weeks, but this is the biggest pot of delegates
yeah,
by
it's
far.
just math.
Just
that not seeing a path for her.
Exactly.
But my point was that we've already kind of been struggling to see where she was going with this, what she was playing at, and what she was still in the race for, and getting answers like, well, to be president was like, but where's the path? But and I was moved by what she said in Michigan, that 40% is not 50%, but it's not nothing, and that she is really clearly feeling like she is running for this substantial Republican coalition that is not voting for Trump and wants to be giving voice to that still.
Yeah, it's not nothing. But if you just look at the math, because that is where we are right now, 43% of the proportional delegates tonight, that's her highest margin in any state so far. That would only be 110 out of 850 plus.
Yeah, and just speaking with the Trump campaign this morning, they're workshopping language around avalanche of delegates, right? They're trying their hardest to try to push her out of the race so they can fully and more officially pivot to this general election. They're reminding us quite consistently about the fact that they've about 7 days out before they hit that magic number, et cetera. And they're now casting Nikki Haley as a thorn in former President Trump's side and a hindrance to his being able to gain some type of momentum against Biden.
And Margaret, let's go back to the not nothing comment, because the question that we were talking a little bit about earlier that is going to be even more in focus after tonight is how Donald Trump is going to get those voters and whether they will even come to Donald Trump. Our Jeff Zeleny has been in North Carolina talking to voters. Let's listen, and they're Haley voters. Yes. Let's listen to some of what they said.
I hope that somebody is lurking behind the scenes coming out with an alternative. But if not, then I would vote for Joe Biden over Donald Trump in a heartbeat.
I hated voting for Trump last time, but I'll do it again with my nose plug. I just can't believe, though, that that's what we have to choose from.
I've been intrigued for a while now at the whole notion of a legitimate third party.
So if you're watching this, you could say, is Nikki Haley trying to be the future third-party candidate, or is Nikki Haley trying to recapture the Republican Party if Trump becomes the nominee and is not able to win again? And it is that latter. Mm-hmm. But so, I mean, what she has been doing is establishing herself over these past number of weeks as the standard bearer of the opposition inside the Republican Party. There's the Liz Cheney model and there's the Chris Christie model, and neither one of those is established to be the standard bearer of a future nominee of the Republican Party. At least not right now is how it looks. That role is available, and she is positioning herself. She's trying out for that role. And if Trump is resoundingly reelected this time around and manages to serve for 4 years without getting impeached multiple times and without there being a crisis, then I don't know where Nikki Haley is in 2028. But if any of those pieces don't fall into place, if he becomes the nominee but cannot get reelected, if he were to become reelected and it were to be a disaster, she is saying the things now that she will go back and look to later and say, I told you this was a risk for the party. Yeah. There are elements of the Republican Party that used to be elements of the Democratic Party, the working class, the elements of populism, the Rust Belt. There are elements of the Republican Party that are out in the wilderness right now that Nikki Haley is a part of. The ties to corporate America, the respect for the establishment, the strong national security. She is seeking to hold on to that aspect of Republicanism and to try to rebrand it down the road.
You have a real quick.
Well, the problem with the I told you so gambit is that she doesn't have the last word there. And you've already got all these Republicans saying every day she stays in the race hurts Trump against Biden. Every dollar she spends is a dollar spent helping Biden. And so the story in response is going to be, well, no, it's not that you told us so. This is your fault.
You made it happen. Yeah. Very interesting. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Coming up, the Cookie Monster has had enough.
Cookie!
He says his favorite food is shrinking, and he's not alone. The White House's message to Cookie Monster and the rest of the world about so-called shrinkflation. That's next. One of Sesame Street's beloved characters, Cookie Monster, is apparently feeling the pain of high prices. He took to social media to vent his frustrations about what else? Cookies. I will spare you my Cookie Monster invitation. You're welcome, America. But you see it there on the screen. He's not happy about the cost of the cookies that he eats. Cookie Monster's gripe got the attention of the White House, which responded, quote, "As it turns out, C is not just for cookie, it's also for consumers getting ripped off." Shrinkflation is just one of the pocketbook issues that could find its way into the State of the Union address on Thursday. Today, the White House is announcing a new strike force tasked with cracking down on price gouging, and everything from groceries to prescription drugs is on the list. Arlette Saenz joins us now from the White House. Arlette, talk about this task force.
Well, Dana, this is the latest attempt by President Biden to try to show Americans that he's working to lower cost in junk fees that they face in their everyday lives. This so-called strike force will aim to try to curb illegal and unfair pricing on everything, as you mentioned, from prescription drug prices to health care to groceries. The president's expected to speak about this a little bit later in the afternoon when he meets with his competition council here at the White House. And one of the centerpieces of the announcements today is this effort to slash the credit card late fees from a current average of $32 to $8. That would save Americans who are paying these late credit card fees about $220 a year. There's about 45 million Americans who are paying these late fees, and it would add up to a total of $10 billion in savings over 1 year for the entire country. It's just one of the efforts the president has tried to make to cut junk fees, which is expected to be a key focus of his State of the Union address on Thursday. We're told that the president is expected to lean heavily into this argument relating to economic populism, talking about raising taxes for corporations and to the wealthy, as well as trying to lower prescription drug costs and other everyday costs. It all comes at a time when they're trying to move the needle with voters, specifically on the issue of the economy, with many voters still feeling that they feel they are worse off now than when President Biden took office.
And Arlette, the White House is reacting to a string of unfavorable polls. What are you hearing?
Yeah, President Biden actually just a short while ago tried to claim to reporters that he has been leading in the past 5 polls that have been released, saying that the news media doesn't pay attention to the polls where he's ahead. But if you take a look at our CNN average of the polls, it's found that there's no clear leader in this race, with 48% supporting Trump and 46% supporting Biden in a hypothetical head-to-head matchup. Now, the campaign has long said that it's still very early in this campaign to be fretting about polls, but there is anxiety among some Democrats about whether President Biden will be able to pull this off come November.
Arlette, thank you so much joining me to talk about this and the general election campaign that is about to be in full swing. Democratic pollster Anna Greenberg and Republican strategist Alex Conant. I want to start, Anna, with you about the idea of what the White House, as we gear up for the State of the Union later this week, is clearly trying to focus on, hit the areas where voters are feeling it the least. When I say it, it's the economy getting better. I know you are working on a lot of congressional races, many of which are in not just swing districts, but swing districts in swing states. What data are you seeing that backs up, if any, this kind of move?
Well, I think it would be foolish not to talk about the economy, particularly when you see the kind of poll numbers that we've been seeing, not just now, but really since he's been president, and this disconnection between what the macroeconomic indicators say and how people are actually feeling. So as the president who's overseen the economy, not talking about it is nuts. And certainly he has a lot of really important accomplishments to talk about. But I would also just say is that if you look at the 2022 election and think about July, when inflation was at its highest and gas prices were $5, $6 a gallon, it turned out that election wasn't about inflation. It turned out if you asked people why they voted Democratic because of abortion and because of democracy. And if you voted Republican, it was immigration and crime and also to some degree inflation. And so I also think we should not overthink this, right? And really think about what are people actually voting on in 2024, going back in time, what are they voting on in 2024? And is it actually going to be about the economy? Because it wasn't in 2022, and it wasn't in 2023, and it wasn't in New York 3, where Democrats just won a big win.
I mean, as you answer that, I want to know what you think the voters are going to go to the polls about. one of the things that was most striking and worried a lot of Democrats over the weekend was this New York Times poll. If you went inside, one question: how have the candidates' policies affected you? Only 18% said Biden's policies have helped. 40% said Trump. That's part of the what Democrats call the amnesia of the Trump years. Biden, the flip side is also not great. Hurt me, 43% for Biden.
And I think that's inflation, right? The reason that Biden is talking about inflation this week, even though the official inflation numbers are pretty good at this point,
are.
The reason he's talking about it is because if you ask people on the street, if you ask average voters, if you do a poll like that one, they still say that the economy is bad. And what they're talking about is they're paying a lot more for stuff, especially food now, than they were 2 or 3 years ago. And I think that there's just going to be a real lag time. And I think it's an open question. Come November, are voters still upset about how much they're paying for eggs, milk, and bread? Because if they are, they're going to hold the incumbent, Biden, accountable for that, not Trump.
Okay, so that's one question, maybe the question going forward. But until we get there, we have tonight and then in the days and weeks following what's going to happen inside the Republican electorate.
Yep.
Mark Cuban, who's never been a fan of Donald Trump, said the following. He said, if we're having his last wake and it was him versus Trump, meaning Biden, and he was being given last rites, I would still vote for Joe Biden. So the question is whether or not there are Nikki Haley voters out there who are that stridently against Donald Trump and would go for Joe Biden. And would it make a difference?
I think there's no question that there are at least some. And those are the voters who didn't turn out to vote Republican in 2018, 2020, 2022. And I think it's a big question. Do they not turn out in 2024, or do they turn out and vote for Joe Biden in 2024? Because if they do, Trump's going to lose again. So I think that those Nikki Haley voters, that 30 to 40% that she's consistently getting in the primaries, they ultimately probably will decide the election this fall. And they'll either decide it by voting for Trump, Biden, or just staying home, all of which is just critical in a race that's likely to be decided by tens of thousands of votes across 5 states. Those voters are going to be really, really important.
Oh, I agree completely. And I think that if you think about Carrie Lake, when she told all the John McCain voters to go away and not support her campaign, didn't really help her win that against Katie Hobbs. And when you hear Donald Trump talk about Nikki Haley and her supporters and sort of tell them to go away and they're not welcome in the party anymore, I think that is a colossal mistake that he is making.
Yeah. But he has a lot of time to make up.
Sure, but you know, most of the Nikki Haley voters are better educated, news aware, more moderate. They aren't people who are going to forget that the former president told them to get out of the party.
I think that if I was Trump, the concern I would have right now is that they are turning out not because they love Nikki Haley. They're turning out to vote against Donald Trump. And I thought the quote you just read from Mark Cuban, what's interesting is he doesn't love Joe Biden.
No, he doesn't.
He's not endorsing Joe Biden. He's saying, I'm going to go vote against Trump no matter what I can do. He said today he would go vote for Nikki Haley. I guess he did vote for Nikki Haley.
Yeah.
So, look, those are the voters that are they going to turn out to vote against Trump this fall or not? And he needs to reach out to them.
Great conversation. I learned a lot. Always do from both of you. Thank you so much. Coming up, we head back out west for an update further west than Utah. We're going to go to California, the most expensive political contest of the year, not including the presidential election. The latest from California's jungle primary next. Now to California, where voters are picking a replacement for the late Senator Dianne Feinstein. It is an incredibly rare opportunity to win an open Senate seat there, so it's been very expensive and hard fought between some of the biggest names in California politics. Members of Congress Adam Schiff, Katie Porter, and Barbara Lee. They are fighting on the left. On the Republican side, former LA Dodger superstar Steve Garvey is looking to break through. The big question voters are deciding today is whether the general election will feature 2 Democrats or 1. That's because California has a so-called jungle primary, meaning the top 2 candidates will advance to the general election in November, regardless of their party, and with more than $71 million being spent on ads. The race is the most expensive political contest of the year besides the presidential election. Our Stephanie Elam is standing by in Santa Ana, California. Stephanie.
Yeah, and Dana, they've spent more money on ads for this Senate race in California than there has been spent on presidential ads. So that just shows you how competitive it is here. And Adam Schiff by far has amassed the largest war chest to go about the battle of getting these ads out there and to win. He says he's still going to fight like he's the underdog. And just for comparison purposes, in 2018 for Senator Feinstein's re-election, that was a $4.2 million spend. And then if you look at 22, when Senator Alex Padilla went back to get his first full term as senator from California, that cost just over $6 million. So you look at that over $71 million number, and it's a massive number here. Also, what's interesting here is that you've got the fact that whoever those first two candidates are, they are the ones who are going to go head-to-head in November. So that's why today's election for Senate is so important. Will it be two Dems against each other, or will it be a Democrat versus a Republican, taking a look at the baseball star Steve Garvey? That's what a lot of people are waiting to see if that will happen. But keep in mind, here in California, Democrats outnumber Republicans 2-1. So it tends to be a blue state. So that's something that people are interested in. I should also note, Dana, that it's noteworthy with all that money being spent on ads, not $1 of that has been from an ad spent by Steve Garvey. Not one.
Wow. I didn't realize that. That's really interesting, Stephanie. He might not be spending money on himself, but one of his opponents is spending money trying to prop him up, and that is Adam Schiff. He's running ads touting the conservative record of Republican Steve Garvey. We'll explain why after our viewers watch some of it.
Conservative Republican Steve Garvey voted for Trump twice, surging in the polls. Fox News says he'd boost Republican control. Democrat Adam Schiff stands up for us.
So you mentioned the 2-1 margin of Democrats to Republican voters in California. That's why Adam Schiff is boosting Garvey, because he wants to run against a Republican, not a fellow Democrat, right?
Yeah, because obviously they'll be battle axing if it gets to November and it's Democrat versus Democrat. If it turns out that it's a Republican, that's going to weigh in the Democrats' favor. Adam Schiff has been leading these polls. People know who he is outside of California as well, because he was so influential in former President Trump's first impeachment trial. So he has the recognition. People believe that he can actually do the job that needs to be done, considering what the progressives and the Democrats are looking for. But yeah, it seems that because of this attack, it's actually raised the profile of Steve Garvey in California. Remember, he played for the Dodgers and the Padres. So he's a Southern California guy. All of the state doesn't know him perhaps as well. And so this is helping to raise his profile overall, that actually could help him get that top 2 position so that Adam Schiff thinks it'll be easier for him to defeat him come November.
Stephanie Elam, thank you so much for that. Up next, a swift call to action by superstar Taylor Swift on this Super Tuesday. This Super Tuesday, Taylor Swift is reminding voters not to leave a blank space. The superstar urged her 282 million Instagram followers to get out and vote. And it seems when Taylor speaks, Swifties listen. Last fall, she encouraged followers to register to vote. And just 1 hour after that post, Vote.org reported a more than 1,200% jump in participation. It's one of the many reasons we are sure President Biden is hoping his karma is another presidential endorsement. Thanks for joining Inside Politics today. CNN News Central starts after the break.
With a cold, medicine.
Beats. I'm Jeremy Diamond in Tel Aviv, and this is CNN.
Welcome to another primary edition of CNN News Central. I'm Boris Sanchez in Washington, D.C., alongside Brianna Keeler, and it is a Tuesday unlike any other. It's Super Tuesday, so millions of Americans are going to cast votes across 16 states and American Samoa. It could be a decisive day for President Biden and Donald Trump, who are hoping to have their respective presidential nominations all but clinched by the end of the night. And we could see answers to really critical questions. Will this be the final day of Nikki Haley's campaign? Will President Biden face more protest votes from frustrated Democrats? And is there an appetite for Trump-style Republicans down ballot?
We may have the answers within hours, and looming over all of these questions are these polarizing issues that voters are weighing: immigration, abortion, and inflation among them. CNN has reporters on the ground across the country, so let's start in the increasingly purple North Carolina with Diane Gallagher. Diane, what are you hearing from voters there?
So we've had pretty steady turnout at this particular polling location in Cornelius, North Carolina, or about 40 minutes north of Charlotte. And you can probably see a couple people standing out here. The majority of voters that I've spoken with have given me issues like education, abortion, democracy, and the border as what is key for them when going in there and choosing their ballot. Now, in North Carolina, most voters, the largest number of registered voters, are unaffiliated. So they can go in and choose Democrat or Republican, whichever they want to. And I've been talking to voters who say that they're looking at the top of the ticket, but also an extremely long down ballot in this state, with everything from the governor and the attorney general to members of Congress and local races they have to choose from as well. I spoke with a Haley voter, a Trump voter, and a Biden voter about why they made the decisions they did today. Take a listen.
I chose to vote Republican, but I'm an independent.
Who did you vote for? Do you mind me asking?
Nikki Haley.
Why?
Vote against Trump.
He's the only man that can help us as a country and bring everything back the way it should be. A normal day-to-day living for all Americans.
I want to make sure that gun laws in our country, especially with schools, that's taken care of, and just opportunity for resources. I know abortion laws is always changing, so making sure there's opportunities for ladies that do seek abortion, they can get the opportunity to do so, and they have equal rights to take care of their body.
Now, I will tell you that all of the Haley voters that I've spoken with today tell me that they were unaffiliated, and they actually do plan to vote for President Biden in November. But this was something of a protest vote for them during this primary season. Also, they wanted to weigh in on the Republican side of those down ballot races. You know, Boris, Brianna, more than 695,000 North Carolinians have already cast early ballots before they started even voting today on primary day here.
And Diane, the gubernatorial primary in North Carolina is expected to be really contentious, given some of what we've seen happen in North Carolina recently, specifically that abortion ban that was passed in the state. That's going to be a central issue in the general election campaign, and I imagine it's on voters' minds in the primary as well.
It is, and especially, of course, on the Republican side of the gubernatorial race here. You have three main Republicans who are running. Of course, the front runner, the current Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson, who is a bit of a lightning rod, if you will, for controversy. He has a history of offensive, inflammatory, and bigoted remarks, especially those that he's tried to, in some of his more conservative positions, avoid talking about as much on the trail, including past positions of wanting to ban all abortion, including any exceptions in the past. Now, his opponents, businessman Bill Graham, as well as the state treasurer Dale Folwell, have said that they feel like come the general election that Democrats are just going to, quote, play the hits and use past statements against the lieutenant governor in the general election. Now, on the Democratic side, the current Attorney General Josh Stein is the overwhelming favorite, but he does have some competition, including the endorsement from the Progressive Caucus from a retired Supreme Court Justice in Mike Morgan. We will see what happens there, but the belief, of course, Brianna and Boris, is that we will see both the Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson, who has been endorsed by former President Trump, as well as Josh Stein, proceed on to the general election there for a very competitive race.
Diane Gallagher live for us from Cornelius, North Carolina. Thanks so much. Let's get to Virginia now, and CNN's Elena Treen. Elena, Donald Trump lost the general election there both times that he's run in 2016 and 2020. With voters that you've talked to, does that mean that there's an opening for Nikki Haley there?
You know, it's really interesting, Boris and Brianna, because South Carolina is one of few states participating in Super Tuesday that actually have open primaries. That means Republicans, Democrats, independents alike. As long as they are registered voters, they can come to the polls and pick whichever candidate they want. And so I think it's been reflected, actually, in some of the interviews I've done. We've heard from a variety of people as they've been leaving that polling location just behind me. Some say they voted for Biden, others for Donald Trump, some for Nikki Haley. Now, it's been really interesting. I actually spoke to a lot of voters who did say they voted for Nikki Haley. They are Republicans. They say they identify as that. However, they varied on whether or not they would vote for Donald Trump in a potential Trump versus Biden general election rematch. Take a listen. If it ends up being a Trump versus Biden rematch, do you know who you'd vote for?
Yeah, I'll hold my nose and vote for Biden again.
Are you at all thinking about Donald Trump again this time, particularly if he becomes the nominee?
No. If he becomes the nominee, it's going to be a terrible decision.
We're going to move.
Well, I know, but I can't see any Democrat solving any of the problems. And I can't see Donald Trump solving the problems. That's why I think Nikki Haley's got some sort of chance.
I like Nikki Haley a lot.
Yeah.
Now, Boris and Brianna, the through line that I've really heard from all of my conversations today is that those who voted for Joe Biden or for Nikki Haley, they were really casting their votes against Donald Trump, which I found very interesting. Some of them did have things that they liked, of course, in each candidate, but they said they really were motivated by their dislike of Donald Trump. And I do just think, going back to the open primary aspect of the race here in Virginia, is it could potentially help Nikki Haley. I mean, we know that her campaign has really been pushing for moderates and independents to come out and vote for her. We'll see if that makes a difference, but it is an interesting dynamic here in the state.
Yeah, certainly is. Elena Treen, thank you. And we also have Brian Todd in Utah. And Brian, you are in a state where Donald Trump performs pretty poorly compared to how other Republicans have done. The Haley team is banking on a strong showing there tonight. Tell us about this.
Right, Brianna and Boris. Donald Trump has gotten lukewarm support here in past election cycles. We're going to set the scene for you quickly here. This is where the caucus goers here are going to start showing up in about 7 hours. Voters are not coming in all day like they do in the primary states. They're going to show up here for the caucus in about 7 hours' time, all showing up here at once at Alta High School here in Sandy, Utah. 32 different precincts are going to be voting here tonight, so it's going to be a very busy caucus night here as we kind of pivot and show the rest of the area here with the beautiful mountain ranges. Those are the Oquirrh Mountains over there. The Wasatch Mountains are here. Spectacular views, I have to say. Now, as far as Nikki Haley maybe getting some support here that she's counting on, Nikki Haley does have some advantages here. The lukewarm support for Donald Trump in the past. Donald Trump lost the 2016 caucus here pretty handily to Ted Cruz. He did beat Joe Biden in the general election in 2020 here in Utah, but there are other factors favoring Nikki Haley. The governor of Utah has said he doesn't really like Donald Trump or Joe Biden. That's Spencer Cox, the Republican governor. He has not formally endorsed Nikki Haley, but he says he likes Nikki Haley. The governor's wife, Abby Cox, has endorsed Nikki Haley. Also, the Lieutenant Governor, Deirdre Henderson, has endorsed Nikki Haley. So that does play into the dynamic here. And you've got the Mitt Romney factor here in Utah, the retiring U.S. Senator, former presidential candidate, still a popular figure here in Utah. Clearly kind of an anti-Trump person. He's been very critical of the former president for years. And will Mitt Romney's influence play a part here in Utah? Now, the advantage that Donald Trump has here is that this is a caucus run by the party, and the caucuses run by the parties tend to kind of draw the more conservative, committed voters. That's going to favor Donald Trump here. So is that going to be enough to carry him over the top here in Utah in the caucuses? We're going to find out later tonight. Here is a sample of the ballot that they're going to be casting here. This is very simple. You got Ryan Binkley here at the top. Then Nikki Haley and Donald Trump. That's what voters are going to be doing. Once they come in and listen to the speeches, then they're going to be casting the votes at about 7 p.m. local time. That's 9 p.m. Eastern time. And then the count will take place about an hour later. We're going to have access to the school, go in, kind of rove around those 32 different rooms where the votes are going to be taking place, and hopefully show our voters a lot of that dynamic. It's going to be a pretty fun evening here.
Certainly will be. We'll be looking to see if it's an outlier. Brian Todd, thank you. Let's bring in CNN senior political analyst Mark Preston on what we should be watching for today. I think Utah is going to be interesting because even though it's such a red state, Trump doesn't really do that well there. But that might be this one bright spot that Nikki Haley's really looking for. And she told Jake Tapper yesterday she'd stay in the race as long as we're competitive. So I wonder, Mark, how you read that. What that could mean for her campaign if she doesn't have any wins tonight or if she just has maybe one.
Sure. Let me first say that Brian Todd
just brings excitement to like a boring, empty room. Like Brian Todd can bring it, but also very informative. Like here's the situation with Nikki Haley. Mathematically impossible. Of course, we know that. The data that we'll all be looking at, will it be corrupted basically because people aren't necessarily engaged? They're not going out to the primaries. However, she did raise $28 million in January and February. So if she wants to continue on, how much money does she have left now? Because, you know, when you're at the beginning of a campaign, you only have to spend money traveling around Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, small states, smaller media markets, not as expensive. She has to go to, you know, California and Texas and Minnesota and just all across the country. So at some point, you know, she's probably going to realize that she doesn't have the funds to keep going.
Notable that she's not even out on the campaign trail today. She's back home in South Carolina. Perhaps gives you an indicator of where her mental state is at on a pivotal day for her campaign. On the flip side, for President Joe Biden, we saw this concerted campaign to vote uncommitted in Michigan. We're not expecting those kind of numbers today. When you look at the primaries for Democrats, is turnout a barometer of where the president stands in the minds of voters right now?
This is what I think. I mean, I would consider it like having like a cold, okay? So, like, you know, look what happened in Michigan. It spread beyond Muslims, right, and Arabs, what have you, and it connected to, like, other dissatisfaction, which were young people who might not necessarily have been fully engaged in what's going on with Israel and Hamas, but now they are getting engaged, right? And then it also connects over to the more progressive folks who, again, may not have been as engaged in what's going on in Israel and Hamas, but they're all kind of coming together, and this cold now is, you know, becomes a bigger problem. Now, if you look at what's going to happen tonight, look at Minnesota to see necessarily if there was any spillover from an adjoining state. But, you know, also let's look in the Commonwealth of Virginia, where I live, or in North Carolina as well. Specifically, you know, there'll be enough people that come out that will continue to send the message to President Biden that he needs to change his policy on that issue. Yeah, and if some of the rhetoric the Biden administration has sort of amped up since Michigan, if that's going to make a change in how they're reacting with their ballots, we'll see that as well. Yeah. You mentioned the data and basically raised this idea, like, are the polls really going to show us what's going on? Because enthusiasm can sometimes mess with that a little bit. So what kind of questions do you have about what we are going to see today versus what we've been seeing in the polls, and how enthusiasm can impact that? Well, Virginia, as a perfect example, again, a state where I live that has very reliable red areas, certainly around the Washington, D.C. area, you know, reliably blue in those suburbs. You know, the question is, will people even come out? You know, I know several Republicans who were probably going to vote for Nikki Haley, but said, why am I even going to go to the polls today? Because honestly, it just doesn't matter. It wasn't the same kind of enthusiasm or, I guess, focus that you saw in Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, three small states that really, you know, is familiar with playing a really important role in the process. And then you come to some of these big states and folks are saying to themselves, look, if Donald Trump's going to win, you know, then he's going to win. That's really no reflection on Nikki Haley. It's just a reflection of the reality of where we are now. Yeah, those early states set the tone. At this point, the tone's been set. Yeah. Mark Preston, always appreciate the analysis. Thanks so much. Still plenty more news to come on News Central. From sitcom seat to House seat, actor Ben Savage of Boy Meets World fame is now running for Congress. We look at his contest and a slew of other down-ballot races with major implications. And he's got 91 problems, but winning the GOP nomination probably ain't one. How the former president has turned his criminal indictments into a campaign rallying cry. Today, President Biden's strategy is clear, and that is get out the vote and go after former President Trump. Here's part of his message earlier on a Dallas morning radio show.
Think of the alternative, folks. If we lose this election, you're going to be back with Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, anyway, the way he talks about, the way he acted, the way he dealt with the African-American community, I think has been shameful.
Joining us now, CNN political commentators, analysts, wise voices. Wise voices. Karen Finney and Kristen Soltis Anderson. Ladies, thank you so much for being with us. Karen, first to you, how big is today a test for President Biden? We were just chatting with Mark Preston about the uncommitted vote in Michigan. He sort of described it as a contagion of sorts. He wants to see how far it spreads. What do you think?
It was an important point that he made, although I would point out that Biden did better this time than Obama did in 2012. And that's one of the things that we've been looking at, is because it's the most, best comparison. It'll give us we'll have some indicators. I think one of the things, though, that is important is just to see where people turn out in terms of, we've had quite decent turnout in a number of these states where there hasn't really even been much of a campaign. And so that tells us people are primed to vote. And I would even say with the folks who are voting uncommitted, they clearly care about making their voices heard. So if over the course of the next several months we can move them back into the president's, and many of them said they weren't necessarily voting against President Biden. So if we can win those votes, that bodes well for the fall.
A lot of Democrats are saying they're voting uncommitted, but they're still engaged in the process. Yes. We'll see, like you said, if that translates. I wonder, Kristen, how you think the Biden campaign should be looking at turnout today on this huge day, and what that could be something they're reading into the general election?
Well, I think turnout is going to be a big issue for Democrats in the general, because their coalition is comprised of a lot of groups that have expressed real dissatisfaction with Joe Biden, young voters chief among them. Young voters not being a huge piece of the Republican coalition these days, but a big part of how Democrats put their wins together. And getting young people to turn out in a primary is always a challenge, but especially if they are among the groups saying they're the least likely to approve of Biden. You would want to see more young voters learning where their polling place is, getting engaged, making their voice heard. With that said, I am reluctant to read too much into what happens tonight, because we have a long way to go, and there are a lot of voters who right now may participate in a primary to blow off some steam, to say, I'm ticked off at the options that we have, and I want to make known that I don't like those options. But when push comes to shove in November, they will probably pick a side.
I'm just going to say, I think that's a really important point, because think about, particularly on the Democratic side, we don't really have much of a primary. Okay, Dean Phillips, but not really. So it is an opportunity for people to just make their voices heard in a way that you would if there was a primary, where you would be, kind of checking the different candidates out and seeing who you're interested in.
Kristen, on the other side, you mentioned we have a long way to go. It doesn't seem like we have a long way to go for Nikki Haley. She's not out there campaigning today. We're not expecting her to give a big speech at a rally tonight. This is effectively over for her?
Well, as long as you have resources, you can stay in the race. But I do think that once you get through Super Tuesday, you have given Republican voters in a lot of states the opportunity to make their voice heard. If you don't like Donald Trump, to blow off that steam, as I mentioned. But once you get past Super Tuesday, the risk becomes that suddenly, if Donald Trump is looking like he's going to lose in November, and that's what Nikki Haley keeps saying, he's going to lose in November, suddenly, the longer you're in the race, the more he's going to say, see, she wouldn't let the party heal. Now, Donald Trump keeps picking at the scab. He's the one for sure that keeps saying, if you're not with me, if you're with Nikki Haley, you're out of the party. But the sooner that the primary ends on the Republican side, the faster the party really can consolidate.
And I would just make an analogy to 2016. Although Nikki Haley is not having the same impact that Bernie did on Hillary, she is still turning out people who are saying, I am not voting for Donald Trump. And again, if you look in the state, 25%, 20%, that could be the margin of victory in a lot of these states in the fall if we, again, can have those voters support Biden.
So, Karen, the New York Times today has this headline, do Americans have collective amnesia about Donald Trump? And a story about how, quote, the erosion of time appears to be working in Mr. Trump's favor as swing voters base their support on their feelings about the present, not the past. How does the Biden campaign need to confront that?
I think Donald Trump is going to help us do a lot of that work, frankly, because the more, when we are in the general election, which frankly I think starts tonight, and Thursday will be the first speech of the general election, the more we are seeing the split screen of the two men and hearing more from Donald Trump. Because again, we haven't been hearing from him every day, all day, tweeting and, changing, news broadcasts at the last minute with a tweet. Then I think people will start to remember the chaos that we had, and as well as the vitriol. And he will be so focused on the past. And hopefully, Biden, we're going to hear it Thursday and going forward, is talking about what's in our future. And I do think that's going to make a big difference.
Kristen, last word to you.
I think that for Joe Biden, he profited back in 2020 from the fact that voters felt like Trump had been very chaotic, wasn't for them. They wanted to turn the page. But what they've found with Joe Biden is that things haven't necessarily felt more unified, less chaotic. So Biden has lost that advantage. He's got to make sure that the economy is better, the sorts of things that are pushing voters who don't like Donald Trump to nevertheless say, maybe I want to go back to that.
And Kristen Soltis Anderson, Karen Finney, ladies, thanks so much. Appreciate it.
In California, it is the race that everyone is talking about. We're not talking about Trump or Biden. We're going to go there next. All right, welcome back to CNN News Central's special coverage of Super Tuesday. And we're not just focusing on the presidential primaries. In California, voters are deciding who's going to face off in November to fill the seat of the late Senator Dianne Feinstein. The race critical, one that could alter the current Senate makeup. Frontrunners on the Democratic side in a three-way race. Congressman Adam Schiff, whose national profile skyrocketed from his starring role in former President Trump's first impeachment trial. And then there's Congresswomen Barbara Lee and Katie Porter. And on the Republican side, former Dodger great Steve Garvey and attorney Eric Early. CNN's Stephanie Elam is watching turnout at a polling precinct in Southern California, there in Santa Ana. Tell us what you're seeing. Tell us what we might expect.
Well, Brianna, I can tell you that there's been a slow trickle of people coming in here to drop off their ballots, some of them coming in to make sure that their names are right so they can vote. Here in California, as you know, a lot of people can vote by mail. So they've already dropped in their ballots and maybe have even gotten their text from the state saying that their ballot has been received and it's been counted. So that's already what the situation is here. But while we do not see this large turnouts for the primary votes, this one does have a lot of importance because of that Senate race that you were just speaking of. The way things are done here in California, the top two candidates that win, no matter what party they're from, go on to the November ballot. So we've seen a lot of ad spending here. In fact, since the beginning of February, more money has been spent on ads here for this Senate race in California than have been spent on the presidential race. More than $71 million has been spent on that. And we're seeing Adam Schiff, who says he's running as if he is the underdog, spending a lot of money. He's got a lot of support from the California Democrats here. There's support within Congress for him as well. So he's moving his momentum that way and also trying to raise the profile of Steve Garvey, the Republican, which may seem counterintuitive, but he's hoping that if he can get Steve Garvey to be the #2 winner, then it will be a Democrat versus a Republican come November, which since the odds here of Democrats are 2-1 versus Republicans, he sees that as a shoo-in that he would be able to fill that position that has been empty since Senator Feinstein passed away in September, Brianna.
Yeah, it's this idea of being able to vote for two Senate candidates, Stephanie, that's kind of a wild thing. I wonder if anyone there is strategizing.
Yeah, so it's really a short-term thing, but you do have to vote. When you get your ballot, you do have to vote for Senator twice. And the reason is there's one to vote for who will finish out Senator Feinstein's term. And then you have to vote again for the full 6-year term that will begin January 2025. Now, you remember Governor Newsom appointed LaFonza Butler to be in that position for now. She already indicated she wasn't going to run for it. So you have to vote to see who will end out the year and then vote for that full 6-year term. And whether or not people are going to vote for the same person or not, that's what we're waiting to see. But it's a very special situation here in California for sure.
California, always special, says this Californian. All right, Stephanie
You love
Elam.
California.
I do.
Yes.
Thank you. Boris?
We are watching several competitive down-ballot races today that could offer some key insights into what to expect in November. And it's not just California. Texas, Alabama, and North Carolina also have races tonight with major political implications. But first, let's look at the special Golden State, as Brianna put it, and California's District 30. That's where there's a familiar face on the ballot. You may know him as Corey Matthews from the hit 90s sitcom Boy Meets World. In the real world, though, former child star Ben Savage is running as a Democrat, and he's trying to fill the seat vacated by Congressman Adam Schiff, who's running for Senate. Savage is just one of some 15 candidates vying to be on that general election ballot. There's another big vacancy in California in District 20. Tonight's race is going to determine the top two candidates running to replace former House Speaker Kevin McCarthy after his resignation earlier this year. The top candidates include a Trump-backed state assemblyman, a local sheriff, and a former teacher. Meantime, Democrats will be eagerly watching the Senate primary in Texas. Congressman Colin Allred, a former NFL linebacker, he's amassed a sizable war chest, but can he surpass that 50% threshold needed to avoid a runoff in May? He's running against State Senator Roland Gutierrez and State Representative Carl Sherman. On the Republican side, no real surprises expected there. Senator Ted Cruz well on his way to locking up the nomination tonight in his quest for a third term. Let's now move to the South for an ultra-rare contest because friends have become foes in Alabama's 1st Congressional District. Because of redistricting, you can have 2 Republican incumbent House members now going head-to-head. Jerry Carl and Barry Moore were both elected into Congress in 2020. Both of them are running on a hardline immigration platform. They both try to position themselves as the more conservative candidate. We'll see who prevails there. And finally, North Carolina, much like Alabama, this is a new congressional map this year. The race to watch there is the governor's race. The Republican frontrunner, he's a lightning rod of controversy. He's the state's first black lieutenant governor, Mark Robinson. He's backed by Donald Trump. Donald Trump actually called him Martin Luther King Jr. on steroids. He has a history of disparaging remarks against LGBTQ+ people, anti-Semitic remarks as well, even dabbling in Holocaust denialism. The leading contender on the Democratic side, State Attorney General Josh Stein, he has the backing of the state's former governor, or rather the state's current governor, whose term limited. Whoever wins these primaries, the race for the governor's mansion in North Carolina will be one of the most competitive on the map come November. A lot to watch out for tonight. Special coverage starts in roughly 4.5 hours. We know you'll tune into that. But don't change the channel just yet, because Donald Trump's court dates have become their own campaign events for the former president. Still ahead on CNN News Central, how his legal issues could play into the election. Stay with us.
Former President Trump is expected to win big in today's primary elections, but his legal roadmap appears more challenging. On Monday, Trump scored a major victory. He did when the Supreme Court struck down a bid to have him removed from the ballot in Colorado. Here in the coming months, though, he'll have to juggle campaigning and a myriad court appearances.
The calendar is loaded. In just 3 weeks, jury selection is going to begin in his hush money trial in New York. Then in April, the Supreme Court will hear oral arguments on whether Trump has immunity for alleged crimes he committed while in office. That ruling will impact if and when Trump's federal election subversion case and his Georgia interference trial may happen. On July 8th, Special Prosecutor Jack Smith wants to start Trump's classified documents trial. And a week later, Republicans hold their national convention where Trump is hoping to officially become the GOP presidential nominee. Let's discuss the loaded calendar and more with Anthony Scaramucci. He's a former Trump White House communications director. Anthony, thanks so much for sharing part of your afternoon with us. I'm wondering, as you hear about the slew of court dates that Donald Trump has, and you're watching tonight on Super Tuesday as it appears that he's just going to dominate across the map, what are you specifically watching for that would give you any indication that there's a weakness in Trump's argument for president that might be persuasive to voters in his base?
Persuasive to voters in his base, Boris, I'm not so sure, because I think Mr. Trump is probably right. He can shoot people on Fifth Avenue and there'll be some level of ardent support in his base. However, some of your polling, CNN polling, suggests that if he's convicted in any one of those cases, there might be a few people that leave him. What I think would be the most concerning thing are independents. Mr. Trump knows that he's not polling well with Nikki Haley voters. I think it's a blended 40% of those voters say they will not vote for him under any circumstances. And so you guys know you have to win the crossover vote to win the presidency. Bernie Sanders voters did not vote for Secretary Clinton. She lost. But, you know, Hillary Clinton voters did vote for Barack Obama. He won. And, of course, Mr. Trump got the voters from the Republicans in 2016. So this is a big issue for him. I'm going to say something very contrarian on your air. I think Jack Smith's onto something with that July 8th court date. Right now, the Trump campaign is riding high. They won a 9-0 in the Supreme Court. But if you're hearing oral arguments in April, you could render a decision in June, which is customary for the court. And I don't think they give Mr. Trump, or any president for that matter, absolute immunity. Selective immunity, sure, while you're in office, but I don't think the Supreme Court wants a president to have the ability to assassinate adversaries or to potentially even insurrect the American government. So you could be in a situation here 3 weeks before the convention where Mr. Trump is in a criminal prosecution with the chief witness being Mark Meadows, his former White House chief of staff.
Anthony, I wonder how you think all of Trump's financial obligations created by his legal issues will be affecting him personally and will be affecting his campaign.
So I don't see it affecting him in his campaign. Could it affect him personally, meaning where he'll have to let go of some assets? My guess is people always over-exaggerate Mr. Trump's wealth, and they under-exaggerate it. And so he is a wealthy person, and I think he can come up with the money necessary to pay these things. Now, of course, he has to post a certain amount of money before the appeal is heard here in the state of New York. But I don't see that as a big feather ruffler for him. A lot of people do. I don't. I think the real case is the January 6th insurrection case, where you've got people who claim they have him on tape premeditating that. And so he's certainly innocent until proven guilty in the court of law. But that's going to be a very heavy case, and there's going to be a lot of unfolding of facts right in prime time of convention season. And that could damage him again with independents, not with his base. I think we've determined that his base is going to be with him no matter what, basically. But I think a lot of independents will be turned off by the illicit activity, the miscreant behavior. And listen, there are going to be a lot more vocal people other than me coming into the fall. There are 38 Trump cabinet and sub-cabinet officials that have said very publicly they would not support the former president to take on that job again. He's unstable, and there's a touch of insanity there. And the people that really love the country that are not politically motivated, I think are going to speak out about this more as we get into the fall.
Yeah, we'll have to see there. Anthony, thank you so much. It's great to have you on, Anthony Scaramucci.
Thanks for having me.
And ahead on CNN News Central, much more on our Super Tuesday coverage. And another story that we are following closely, Ukraine's military claiming a key victory in its fight with Russia's Black Sea Fleet. We're live from Ukraine next. Welcome back to CNN News Central. Here are some of the other headlines that we're watching this hour. Starting in Michigan, where investigators are looking into an explosive fire at a vape shop that sent debris raining down nearly a mile away and killed an onlooker. Officials say the vape shop was storing more than 100,000 vape pens and an excessive number of butane canisters, more than what is allowed for the space. We're told a 19-year-old who was watching the fire from up to a half-mile away was struck and killed by one of those canisters. And an interstate in Nashville has been narrowed to just 2 lanes today as officials investigate the scene of an overnight plane crash. Traffic cameras were recording as a small plane fell onto the highway shoulder and burst into flames, killing all 5 people on board. Shortly before impact, the pilot can be heard by air traffic control in an audio warning that he'd lost engine power and asking for a safe place to land. And finally, a retired Army lieutenant colonel has been charged with sharing classified information on a foreign dating website. Prosecutors say back in 2022, David Franklin Slater attended classified briefings about the war in Ukraine and then sent the classified information to someone who claimed to be a woman living in Ukraine.
Turning now to the war in Ukraine. After claiming they've knocked out a third of Russia's warships since the invasion began, Ukrainian officials are now taking credit for sinking another one. New video shows an explosion aboard the massive patrol ship in the Black Sea. Ukraine says that drones destroyed the vessel, which was reportedly equipped with a missile defense system and had been targeted before. But as Nick Payton-Walsh explains, Ukraine's success at sea comes amid major setbacks on the ground.
It's a lonely path ahead. The Russians have never been louder or closer. Occupied Bakhmut is just up the road. But now, some Ukrainian tank guns are silent just when they're needed most. Here, they don't have enough shells.
Sometimes they just won't fire at all for a whole day. Other days they'll be shooting constantly. And I tell you, it is loud on the other side of that hill, and it's sort of surreal to hear that sort of noise over there and see this tank unit having a ration their ammo.
Без зброї люди є, але без зброї ми самі це не ті війни, що коли з мечем чи шаблею ми могли щось зробити.
We learned they didn't fire at all that day, or the day before, or the next day. The silence here is what losing sounds like. So too is what these soldiers had to say.
Если американцев не решат вам давать деньги, что будет?
Я думаю, що ми всі загинемо просто. Ті, хто тут зараз є, нас не буде.
Is this the worst you've seen it?
Yeah, definitely. I think this year is going to be the worst year in the war. Well, I do know that there's certain units that they're running out of tanks.
How angry does it make you?
Yeah, I'm pissed. I'm absolutely pissed off. There's no point in trying to paint this in any sort of light where it's good for us that Russia takes Ukraine. That's going to be very, very, very bad for us geopolitically.
We've heard a number of things today suggesting that Ukraine is projecting power in ways that strategically were not likely at the start of this war. Taking out a patrol boat called the Sergei Kotov in the Kerch Strait. They said maritime drones did that yesterday. President Volodymyr Zelensky talks about 15 fighter jets being shot out of the sky in just February alone. But I cannot stress to you how complicated and difficult things are here just near the front lines in the east. They are struggling to hold the defensive line that they thought they could hold after they pulled out of Avdiivka 2 weekends ago. Constant series of assaults by Russia, a Russia that is emboldened, a Russia that is rich, a Russia that has endless personnel and financing, and I think a real sense of immediate crisis here in Ukraine, that unless they get that financing now, the forthcoming few months are a foregone conclusion. Yeah, the backdrop, of course, the logjam here in the United States and Congress to get aid over there. Nick Payton-Walsh, thanks so much for the update. Still ahead, our extensive coverage of Super Tuesday rolls on. We're live from Texas and North Carolina, two states holding important primaries. We're back in just moments.